Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came in at 8:47 p.m. on a humid Tuesday evening in April, just as the spring rains were starting to become a daily occurrence in Miami. Officer Raymond had been with the Miami Police Department for 12 years, and wellness checks had become as routine to him as breathing. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio with the familiar cadence of someone who had made thousands of similar calls. Unit 234, we have a wellness check request at 4782 Coral Way, apartment 3B. Neighbor reports elderly resident Margaret hasn't been seen in 4 days, mail piling up. The dispatcher paused briefly before adding the standard note. No response to knocking. Lights have been on continuously. Raymond acknowledged the call and turned his patrol car toward the Coral Gables area, watching the palm trees sway in the evening breeze that carried the threat of another spring storm. The apartment complex was one of those older Miami buildings from the 1960s, painted in that faded coral pink that seemed to be everywhere in this part of the city. He'd been to this complex before, mostly for noise complaints and the occasional domestic dispute, but never to this particular unit. The parking lot was nearly full when he arrived, residents home from work and settling in for the evening. Raymond could hear the distant sound of a television through an open window. Someone cooking dinner with the aromatic smell of garlic and onions wafting through the humid air. Everything seemed perfectly normal, which in his experience meant absolutely nothing when it came to wellness checks. Helen, the neighbor who had called in the concern, was waiting by the building's entrance. She was a woman in her 60s with worried eyes behind thick glasses, wringing her hands as she watched Raymond approach. "Thank God you're here, officer," she said, her voice carrying that particular Miami accent that mixed Cuban inflections with Southern drawl. "Margaret always gets her mail. Every single day at 3 p.m. sharp. You could set your watch by it." Raymond nodded and followed Helen up the exterior stairs to the 3rd floor, his equipment belt creating a rhythmic jangling that echoed in the concrete stairwell. The hallway was dimly lit by overhead fluorescents, one of them flickering intermittently and casting strange shadows on the weathered carpet. Helen stopped at apartment 3B and gestured toward the door where indeed several days' worth of mail was sticking out of the metal mailbox mounted on the wall. "I knocked yesterday morning and again this afternoon," Helen explained, keeping her voice low as if Margaret might suddenly appear and be offended by the fuss. "She's 83 years old, officer, and her health hasn't been the best lately." Helen glanced at the door nervously before continuing. "Her son, Frank, usually visits every weekend, but I haven't seen him either." Raymond approached the door and knocked firmly, using his police knock that was designed to be heard throughout an apartment. "Miami Police, Margaret, we're just checking to make sure you're okay," he called out in a clear, professional voice. The silence that followed seemed to press against his ears, broken only by the distant hum of an air conditioning unit and the muffled sounds of life from other apartments. He knocked again, harder this time, and pressed his ear close to the door. There was something, a faint sound that might have been a television or radio, but it was too muffled to be certain. Raymond tried the doorknob, finding it locked as expected, and then noticed something that made him pause. There was a thin line of light visible under the door, but it had an odd quality to it, flickering slightly as if something was moving inside. "Do you have a contact number for Frank?" Raymond asked Helen, who was hovering anxiously a few feet away. She shook her head, explaining that Margaret was very private about her family matters. She mentioned he lived somewhere in Kendall, but that's all I know, Helen said, her worry deepening the lines around her eyes. Raymond called dispatch to run a check on the apartment's residents and any emergency contacts they might have on file. While waiting for the response, he examined the door more carefully, noting that it was a standard deadbolt and knob lock combination, nothing unusual. The paint around the doorframe was chipped in places, showing layers of different colors from decades of repainting, but there were no signs of forced entry or damage. Dispatch came back with limited information. Margaret had lived in the apartment for 15 years. No criminal record, no previous police calls to the address. They had no emergency contact information on file, which wasn't unusual for elderly residents who had lived in the same place for many years. Raymond made the decision to attempt entry under the welfare check provisions, explaining to Helen that she might want to step back. "I'm going to need to force entry," Raymond told her, positioning himself in front of the door. "Please, stand back by the stairwell." Helen reluctantly moved away but kept watching with obvious concern. Raymond had forced many doors in his career, and this one gave way relatively easily with 2 solid kicks near the lock, the wood splintering around the deadbolt as the door swung inward. The smell hit him immediately, something chemical and sharp that made his nose wrinkle. The apartment was lit by several lamps, all of them on, casting overlapping circles of yellow light across a living room that looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1980s. Floral wallpaper, a velvet couch in deep burgundy, and a coffee table covered with doilies and ceramic figurines. "Margaret," Raymond called out, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his service weapon. "Miami Police, we're here to check on you." The television was indeed on, playing what looked like an old game show with the volume turned low. A cup of tea sat on an end table next to a recliner, and Raymond could see steam still rising from it, faintly in the light. The kitchen was visible through an archway to his left, and Raymond could see dishes in the sink. Not many, just a plate and a cup, with water still dripping slowly from the faucet. Everything looked lived in, normal even, except for Margaret's absence, and that strange chemical smell that seemed to be getting stronger as he moved deeper into the apartment. Raymond proceeded down the short hallway toward what he assumed were the bedrooms and bathroom. The first door on the right was open, revealing a small bathroom with pink tile that was probably original to the building. The medicine cabinet was open, bottles of prescription medication visible on the shelves, some of them knocked over as if someone had been searching for something specific in a hurry. The first bedroom was clearly a guest room, barely furnished with just a single bed and a dresser. The bed was made with military precision, a handmade quilt folded at the foot. Raymond continued to the last door at the end of the hall, which was slightly ajar. He could see light coming from within, and as he pushed the door open with his foot, keeping his hands free, he found himself looking at a scene that made him stop in his tracks. Margaret was there, sitting in a chair facing the window, her back to him. She was wearing a blue housecoat, her white hair neatly pinned up in a bun. For a moment, Raymond felt relief wash over him. She was here, she was fine, probably just hard of hearing and hadn't heard all the knocking. But as he stepped into the room, announcing himself again, he noticed things that made his relief evaporate. She wasn't moving at all, not even the slight rise and fall of breathing. Her hands were placed oddly on the armrests of the chair, fingers spread in an unnatural position, and there was something about the way her head was tilted, too far to one side, that didn't look right. Raymond moved around to face her, already knowing what he would find, but hoping he was wrong. Margaret had passed away, clearly several days ago based on the condition he observed. Her eyes were closed, and someone had positioned her carefully in the chair, arranging her to look peaceful. Raymond immediately backed out of the room, calling for backup and the crime scene unit. This was no natural passing in her sleep. Someone had been here. Someone had arranged this scene. As he waited for backup, Raymond noticed more details he had missed in his initial scan. There were 2 cups in the kitchen sink, not 1. 2 plates. The TV had been on for days, but someone had been making tea recently. That cup in the living room couldn't have been sitting there for more than an hour or 2. Someone had been living in the apartment after Margaret's passing. Helen appeared in the doorway, having ignored his instruction to stay back. "Is she?" she began, but Raymond gently guided her away from the apartment. "I need you to wait downstairs," he told her firmly. "Detectives will want to speak with you." "But what about Frank?" Helen asked, her voice shaking. "Shouldn't someone call Frank?" Raymond made a note to have someone track down this Frank, Margaret's son, though something in his gut told him they needed to find him for more reasons than just death notification. The crime scene unit arrived within 20 minutes, along with 2 detectives who immediately took control of the scene. Raymond gave his report, detailing everything from the initial call to his discovery of the body. The detective in charge, a veteran named Morrison who Raymond had worked with before, listened carefully and then asked him to canvass the other apartments for any information about visitors or unusual activity. The other residents on the floor had little to offer. Most worked during the day and hadn't noticed anything unusual. One elderly man thought he had heard voices from Margaret's apartment a few days ago, but his hearing wasn't good enough to be certain. No one had seen Frank recently, though several confirmed he usually visited on weekends, always carrying grocery bags for his mother. It was nearly midnight when Raymond was finally cleared to leave the scene. The medical examiner had arrived and confirmed what they suspected. Margaret had been deceased for several days. The apartment was now wrapped in crime scene tape, and forensic technicians were processing every surface for fingerprints and DNA evidence. But something kept nagging at Raymond as he sat in his patrol car filling out his report. The teacup in the living room had been warm, not hot, but definitely warm. Someone had made it within the last hour or 2, probably while Raymond was on his way to the apartment. Which meant whoever had been living there with Margaret's body had likely still been there when Helen called for the wellness check. They might have even been there when Raymond knocked on the door the first time. Raymond looked up at the apartment windows, now blazing with the artificial light of crime scene work. Most criminals fled the scene immediately after committing a crime. They didn't stick around for days, making tea and watching television while their victim sat in the next room. This was something different, something deeply disturbing that went beyond simple crime. The next morning brought no rain, just oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick as soup. Raymond had barely slept, his mind replaying the scene in Margaret's apartment over and over. He arrived at the station early, hoping to catch up with the detectives working the case, and found Morrison already at his desk, surrounded by crime scene photos and witness statements. "Couldn't sleep either?" Morrison asked without looking up from a forensic report. Raymond pulled up a chair, noticing the coffee cup on Morrison's desk had been refilled so many times that rings of dried coffee formed a pattern like tree rings around the rim. The ME puts time of death at roughly 3 days ago, sometime Tuesday evening, Morrison continued, sliding a photo across the desk. The photo showed Margaret as Raymond had found her, positioned in that chair with unnatural precision. There were no obvious signs of violence, but the careful arrangement suggested someone had been there when she passed, or shortly afterward. There were also photos of the apartment's interior, every room documented in harsh flash photography that made even the mundane details look sinister. "Here's where it gets interesting," Morrison said, pulling out another set of photos. "These are from the kitchen and bathroom. Look at the timeline." He spread them out like playing cards, each one tagged with a specific detail. The dishes in the sink, the prescriptions that were recently refilled, the fresh groceries in the refrigerator dated from Sunday. Raymond studied the photos, noting that someone had indeed been shopping for Margaret recently. The refrigerator contained fresh milk with a sell-by date 2 weeks out, fresh vegetables, and prepared meals in Tupperware containers, each one labeled with a day of the week in neat handwriting. Someone had been taking care of Margaret, planning her meals, making sure she had what she needed. "Frank," Raymond said, but Morrison shook his head. "That's what we thought initially, but here's the thing. We tracked down Frank. Franklin Sawyer, Margaret's only son." Morrison pulled out another file, this one significantly thicker. "He's been deceased for 3 years. Car accident on the turnpike, died on impact." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Raymond felt his stomach drop as he processed this information. "So, who the hell has Helen been seeing visiting Margaret?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be disturbing. "That's the million-dollar question," Morrison replied, leaning back in his chair. "We've got someone who's been impersonating a dead man for God knows how long, visiting an elderly woman regularly, and then ultimately being present when she passed." He paused, rubbing his tired eyes. "But here's what really doesn't make sense. Why stick around after? Why keep making tea and watching TV?" Raymond thought about the chemical smell he'd noticed in the apartment. "The smell," he said suddenly. There was this chemical odor, sharp, not like decomposition. Morrison nodded, flipping through more reports until he found what he was looking for. Forensics found traces of preservation chemicals in the bedroom, Morrison said. Not professional grade, but someone had been trying to maintain the scene. The word hung in the air. They also found evidence that someone had been caring for the apartment meticulously, even after Margaret's passing. The implications made Raymond's skin crawl. Someone had been there when Margaret died, had stayed with her afterward, had been living in her apartment, using her things, watching her television. It was beyond disturbing. It was pathological in a way that suggested a deeply troubled mind. "We need to talk to Helen again," Raymond suggested. "She saw this fake Frank multiple times. She might be able to give us a better description." Morrison agreed, and they decided to visit Helen together that afternoon. In the meantime, they would review security footage from nearby buildings and canvass local stores where the groceries had been purchased. Helen lived just 2 doors down from Margaret's apartment, in a unit that was a mirror image of her deceased neighbors. She let them in with shaking hands, clearly still rattled by the previous night's events. Her apartment smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, despite the prominent no-smoking clause in the building's lease agreement, and she gestured for them to sit at her small dining table. "I just can't believe it," Helen kept repeating, wringing a dish towel in her hands. "Margaret was such a sweet woman. Who would do such a thing?" Morrison gently steered the conversation toward the man Helen knew as Frank, asking her to describe him in as much detail as possible. "He was tall, maybe 6 feet or so," Helen began, closing her eyes as if to better picture him. "Dark hair, always neatly combed. He dressed well, you know, button-down shirts and khakis, very respectable looking." She paused, thinking harder. He had this way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes, if you know what I mean. Raymond took notes while Morrison showed Helen a photo of the real Frank from his driver's license, taken before his death. Helen studied it carefully, then shook her head. "No, that's not him. The man I saw was younger, maybe early 30s. This man looks older and his face is rounder." How long had you been seeing this man visit Margaret? Morrison asked. Helen thought for a moment, absently lighting a cigarette despite having 2 officers in her home. Neither Raymond nor Morrison commented on it. The woman was clearly stressed and needed the comfort of her routine. Maybe 6 months? Could be longer, Helen said, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. He started coming around last fall, I think. Always on Sundays, always with groceries. She suddenly looked up, as if remembering something important. He had a key. Margaret gave him a key after a few weeks. This was significant. It meant Margaret had trusted this imposter enough to give him access to her home. Either he was incredibly convincing in his deception, or Margaret's mental state had deteriorated to the point where she couldn't recognize that this wasn't her son. Given her age and the multitude of medications in her bathroom, both possibilities seemed plausible. "Did you ever speak with him directly?" Raymond asked. Helen nodded, stubbing out her cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. "A few times, just pleasantries in the hallway. He was polite, but never wanted to chat for long. Always said he was in a hurry, had to take care of his mother." Morrison's phone buzzed, and he stepped away to take the call. When he returned, his expression was grim. That was forensics. They found something else in the apartment. He looked at Helen apologetically. "We're going to need to continue this later. Thank you for your help." Back at Margaret's apartment, now fully secured as a crime scene, the forensic team led them to the guest bedroom. What Raymond had initially dismissed as barely furnished and unremarkable had revealed secrets under closer examination. Behind the dresser, they had found a collection of items that painted a disturbing picture. There were dozens of photographs, all of Margaret, taken from various angles and distances. Some appeared to be taken from outside her apartment windows. Others were clearly taken while she was going about her daily routine. The dates on the photo prints went back over a year, long before the imposter had introduced himself as Frank. He had been watching her, studying her, learning her routines. "There's more," the lead forensic tech said, directing them to the closet. Inside, carefully arranged on hangers, were men's clothes, the button-down shirts and khakis Helen had described. But there were also other items. A wig of gray hair, makeup designed to age someone's appearance, and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses similar to what the real Frank had worn in his old photos. "He wasn't just impersonating Frank," Morrison muttered. "He was becoming him." They found a wallet with a fake ID bearing Frank's name, but with a photo that matched Helen's description of the imposter. There were also receipts for the groceries, all paid in cash, and a notebook filled with observations about Margaret's daily routine, her medications, her favorite foods, even her television viewing habits. The notebook was particularly disturbing to read. The handwriting was neat, almost obsessively so, with entries dated over the past year. Subject, wakes at 7:15 a.m. precisely, one entry read. Takes medication with orange juice, not water. Watches Price is Right at 11 a.m. Naps from 2 to 3 p.m. It went on and on, documenting every aspect of Margaret's life in clinical detail. One entry from about 6 months ago marked a shift in tone. Made contact today. Told her I was Frank's friend, that Frank had asked me to check on her. She seemed confused but grateful. Mentioned she hadn't heard from Frank in a while. Another entry a week later. She called me Frank today. Did not correct her. Raymond felt sick reading it. This person had deliberately targeted a vulnerable elderly woman, exploited her confusion about her deceased son, and inserted himself into her life. But the question remained. What happened when Margaret passed? Why did he stay? The answer came from the most recent entries in the notebook. She's becoming more confused, one read from 5 days ago. health declining rapidly, prepared for the inevitable. The next entry, from 3 days ago, the day Margaret died, was just one line. She passed peacefully at 7:43 p.m., will maintain vigil. He was there when she died, Raymond said, the pieces falling into place. Natural causes, but he stayed. Tried to preserve the scene, keep up the routine even after she was gone. Morrison nodded grimly. The question is why, and more importantly, who is this person? The security footage from the building's entrance provided their first real look at the imposter. The quality wasn't great, but they could see a man matching Helen's description entering and leaving the building multiple times over the past months. The most recent footage, from just hours before Raymond had arrived for the wellness check, showed him leaving with a backpack, walking calmly as if nothing was wrong. "We need to get this out to patrol units," Morrison said, already on his phone with dispatch. He's probably still in the area. Someone this obsessed doesn't just walk away. But even as they organized the manhunt, Raymond couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. It came to him as they were reviewing the footage again. The man with the backpack had been walking calmly, yes, but he had also looked directly at the camera. Not a glance, not an accident. He had stared right at it for several seconds, as if making sure he was seen, as if he wanted them to know he had been there. "He's not running," Raymond said suddenly. "He wants us to find him." Morrison looked skeptical, but Raymond continued. "Think about it. He stayed in that apartment for days after she passed. He made fresh tea knowing we were coming. He looked right at the camera. This isn't over for him." The psychological profile they were building suggested someone with a delusional disorder, possibly someone who had lost their own mother and was trying to replace her. The impersonation of Frank suggested an elaborate fantasy where he could be the perfect son to a mother who needed him. But when Margaret passed naturally, he couldn't let go of the role he had created. "We need to check death records," Raymond suggested. "Look for men in their 30s who lost their mothers in the past 2 years, especially those who lived in this area." It was a long shot, but they didn't have many other leads. The fake ID had been professionally made, the fingerprints found in the apartment didn't match anyone in the system, and no one matching his description had been reported missing or was wanted for other crimes. As the day wore on, more disturbing details emerged. The preservation chemicals had been purchased from a medical supply company using fraudulent credentials. The makeup found on Margaret's face was theatrical grade, designed for stage performances. He had been prepared for her passing, had planned for it, maybe even anticipated it in some twisted way. "Officer Raymond," a voice called from the apartment doorway. It was one of the forensic techs, looking pale, despite having seen countless crime scenes. "You need to see this." They followed him back to the guest bedroom, where they had pulled up a section of loose floorboard. Underneath was a small space, and inside that space were more photographs. The photographs hidden beneath the floorboards were different from the others. These weren't surveillance photos of Margaret. These were of other elderly women, at least 6 different ones, all taken in the same observational manner. Some of the women Raymond recognized from missing person reports he'd seen over the past year. Others were unfamiliar, but the dates written on the backs of the photos suggested they were from other cities, other states even. "This isn't his first time," Morrison breathed, flipping through the photos with gloved hands. "He's done this before." Each set of photos was held together with a rubber band, and each had a small index card with notes. Dorothy, Pembroke Pines, 2021, unsuccessful. Ruth, Coral Springs, 2022, 73 days. Evelyn, Homestead, 2022, 45 days. The numbers appeared to indicate how long he had maintained his charade with each woman before something went wrong. Raymond noticed that Margaret's card simply read, "Margaret, Miami, 2023, as if the perpetrator himself hadn't decided how long this would last. Or perhaps he had been planning to continue indefinitely until she had passed naturally. "We need to contact these other jurisdictions," Morrison said, already pulling out his phone. "Find out if any of these women are still alive, if any were reported deceased under suspicious circumstances." As he made calls, Raymond continued examining the hidden cache. There were more notebooks, older ones, filled with the same obsessive documentation of daily routines. One notebook was different from the others. Instead of observations, it contained what appeared to be a manifesto of sorts, written in the same neat handwriting, but with an emotional intensity that the clinical notes lacked. "They need me," one passage read. "These forgotten mothers, abandoned by their real children, left to decay in their loneliness. I give them what they need. A son who cares, who visits, who brings groceries and makes tea." Another passage was more disturbing. "When they start to see through the veil, when the confusion lifts and reality intrudes, that's when they betray me. They all betray me eventually, just like she did." The "she" was underlined 3 times, and Raymond suspected this referred to the perpetrator's actual mother, the origin point of his pathology. Morrison finished his calls with a grim expression. 3 of these women were found deceased in their homes over the past 2 years. Natural causes were listed in all cases. They were elderly, had health issues, no one suspected foul play. He paused, scrolling through his notes. But get this. In each case, neighbors reported that a family member had been taking care of them in their final days. A son or nephew who no one had met before, but who seemed devoted. The pattern was clear now. This individual had been operating for years, targeting elderly women who lived alone, whose real families were either deceased or distant. He would insert himself into their lives, play the role of the perfect caregiver, and when they passed naturally, he would move on to the next one. Margaret had been different only in that he had stayed afterward, unable to let go. "There's something else," the forensic tech said, leading them to the bathroom. "We found this hidden behind the medicine cabinet." It was a small digital camera, the kind that could be easily concealed. When they checked its memory card, they found hundreds of hours of footage, all of Margaret going about her daily routine, unaware she was being filmed. The most recent footage was the most disturbing. It showed Margaret in her final hours, clearly unwell but peaceful. The camera had captured someone arranging things in the room after she had passed, positioning her carefully in the chair. A man's voice could be heard, gentle and sad. "Rest now, Mother. I'll take care of everything." Raymond had to step outside for air after watching it. The calculated nature of it. The delusion that he had been doing something good, something noble even. It was a level of psychological disturbance that went beyond simple crime. This was someone who had created an entire fantasy world and couldn't distinguish it from reality. When he returned, Morrison had news. "We got a hit on the facial recognition from the security footage. Not a perfect match, but close enough to investigate." He showed Raymond a driver's license photo on his phone. His name appears to be Frank Arthur, 34 years old, last known address in North Miami. Lost his mother 18 months ago to Alzheimer's. He was her primary caregiver for 3 years before she passed. The address was for a small house in a rundown neighborhood, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions. Morrison assembled a team for the raid, including SWAT, in case Frank Arthur was armed and dangerous. Raymond insisted on being part of the operation. He had been the one to find Margaret. and he felt a responsibility to see this through. The house looked abandoned from the outside, with overgrown grass and newspapers piling up on the porch. But when they looked closer, they could see that the newspapers were all recent, from the last few days. Someone was collecting them but not disposing of them. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, no light visible from inside even though it was now evening. SWAT made entry through the front door, but the house appeared empty at first. The living room was like a shrine to an elderly woman, presumably Frank Arthur's mother. Photos of her covered every surface, and her clothes still hung in the closets. Her bedroom was preserved exactly as it must have been when she was alive, down to reading glasses on the nightstand and slippers by the bed. They found Frank in the basement. He had converted it into a replica of Margaret's apartment, complete with the same floral wallpaper and burgundy couch. He was sitting in a chair, having tea with a mannequin dressed in elderly women's clothing. When the officers surrounded him, weapons drawn, he didn't resist. He simply set down his teacup and said, "I was expecting you." Raymond watched as they cuffed him, struck by how ordinary he looked. This wasn't some wild-eyed monster, but a bland, unremarkable man who could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's co-worker. Frank looked directly at Raymond as they led him up the stairs and said, "You're the one who found her. I stayed too long, didn't I? But I couldn't leave her alone." During the interrogation that followed, Frank was disturbingly forthcoming. He admitted to everything, seemed almost proud of it. He explained how he had cared for his mother through her decline, how she had forgotten who he was near the end, calling him by his father's name or thinking he was a stranger. The day she passed, she had been lucid for just a moment, had recognized him and told him she loved him. That moment was everything, Frank said, his eyes distant with memory. All those months of being a stranger to her, and then she saw me. Really saw me. He explained how after her death, he couldn't bear the emptiness. He had tried to find another elderly woman to care for, volunteering at nursing homes, but it wasn't the same. They weren't his mother. So, he had begun his elaborate deceptions, finding women who resembled his mother in some way, their age, their living situation, their vulnerability. He would study them, learn everything about them, and then insert himself into their lives. I gave them good months, he insisted. I was the son they needed. I brought them groceries, made them tea, listened to their stories. When asked about Margaret's death, his demeanor changed. "She passed peacefully," he said, agitation creeping into his voice. "I was there, holding her hand. She thought I was Frank, her real son. She was happy." He explained that he had stayed because he couldn't bear to leave her alone, that someone should have been there to honor her. Raymond asked him directly about the tea he had made just before the police arrived. Frank smiled, a disturbing expression given the context. "I knew you were coming." Helen had been nervous for days, looking at me strangely. I knew she would call eventually. He paused, then added, "I made Margaret's favorite, Earl Grey with honey. She liked it sweet." The prosecutor would later describe it as one of the most disturbing cases they had ever handled. Frank was charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and abuse of elderly persons. The investigation eventually connected him to 7 elderly women across Florida, all of whom had died naturally while under his care. The 3 survivors were found in various cities, all confused about the nice young man who had been visiting them, claiming to be a relative. During the trial, Frank maintained that he had been helping these women, giving them comfort in their final years. He showed no remorse for the deception, only regret that his relationships with these women had been cut short. The psychological evaluation revealed a complex delusional disorder, mixed with severe attachment pathology, likely stemming from his complicated relationship with his mother. Helen testified about the man she had known as Frank, breaking down in tears as she described how convincing he had been. He knew things about Margaret that only family would know, she said. Her favorite foods, her stories about growing up in Cuba, even the names of her grandchildren. It emerged that Frank had gathered this information through various means, going through Margaret's mail, listening at her door, and accessing public records. Raymond testified about finding Margaret's body, about the scene in the apartment that suggested someone had been living with her after death. He described the tea that was still warm, the television still playing, the careful positioning of Margaret's body. The jury looked disturbed as he spoke, several members unable to look at the crime scene photos that were presented as evidence. Frank was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, he turned to look at the gallery where Helen and some of the surviving women sat. "I was a good son," he said loudly. "I was the son you deserved." The bailiffs quickly removed him, but his words hung in the air like a curse. Raymond attended every day of the trial, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to the story. In Frank's house, they had found journals going back years, documenting not just his victims but his relationship with his mother. The entries painted a picture of a woman who had been demanding, critical, never satisfied with her son's efforts to care for her. One entry, written just days before his mother's death, was particularly revealing. "She doesn't know me anymore, and it's better this way. When she doesn't know me, she's kind. She smiles. She thanks me for the tea. When she remembers, she tells me I'm doing everything wrong, that I'm not the son she wanted. Maybe I can be the son someone else wanted." The case changed Raymond in ways he wouldn't fully understand until years later. He found himself checking on elderly residents more frequently during his patrols, making sure they had legitimate family checking on them. He became hyper-aware of the vulnerable populations in his district, the people who could easily disappear without anyone noticing for days or weeks. 6 months after Frank's conviction, Raymond received a letter at the station. It was from Frank, written in that same neat handwriting from the notebooks. "Officer Raymond," it read, "I've been thinking about that night you found Margaret. You were gentle with her, even though she was gone. That's how a good son would act. I think you understand more than you let on." Raymond burned the letter, but the words stayed with him. The suggestion that he understood, that there was some connection between him and this disturbed individual, was repulsive but also frightening because on some level, he did understand the loneliness that drove people to desperate acts. He had seen it too many times in his career. People so starved for connection that they would accept any facsimile of it, even from a stranger, even from someone who meant them harm. The Margaret case, as it came to be known in the department, became a cautionary tale used in training new officers about welfare checks and vulnerable populations. But for Raymond, it remained something more personal. Every time he passed that apartment building on Coral Way, he thought about Margaret sitting in that chair, positioned so carefully by someone who claimed to love her like a son. 3 months after Frank's conviction, Raymond thought the case was finally behind him. The media coverage had died down, the apartment had been renovated and rented, and life in Miami had moved on to other tragedies and crimes. But then, Helen called the station asking specifically for him, her voice shaking with the same fear he remembered from that first night. "Officer Raymond, I need to talk to you," she said when he arrived at her apartment. "Strange things have been happening. I think there might have been someone else." She led him inside, where she had laid out several items on her dining table like evidence. There were photographs, letters, and what looked like a journal, all yellowed with age. I was cleaning out Margaret's apartment for the landlord, Helen explained. Her niece from Tampa came down to collect the valuable items, but she asked me to dispose of the rest. I found these hidden inside an old hat box in the closet. She pointed to the photographs first. Look at the dates on the back. Raymond examined the photos, expecting them to be old family pictures. Instead, he found images of Margaret from decades ago, in her 50s or 60s, with a young man who definitely wasn't Frank Sawyer, her real son. The dates on the back ranged from 1998 to 2003, long before Frank Arthur would have been old enough to be stalking elderly women. The young man in the photos looked eerily similar to Frank Arthur. Same build, same general features, but clearly a different person. This is the really scary part, Helen said, opening the journal. The handwriting was different from Frank Arthur's neat script. This was looser, more hurried. The entries described visits to Margaret, gifts brought, meals shared. But, unlike Frank Arthur's clinical observations, these were emotional, almost romantic in nature. My dear Margaret doesn't remember our time together, one entry read, but I remember enough for both of us. Raymond felt a chill run down his spine. Did Margaret ever mention this person? He asked. Helen shook her head, but then paused. Wait, there was something. A few years ago, maybe 2018 or 2019, she mentioned that she had a gentleman call her when she was younger, after her husband died. She said he was very persistent, but she eventually had to ask him to stop coming around. The letters were love letters, dozens of them, all unsigned, but clearly from the same person who had written the journal. They spoke of devotion, of eternal love, of waiting for the right time to be together again. The most recent one was dated just 6 months before Frank Arthur had begun his surveillance of Margaret. The time is almost right, it read. Soon, my dear, we will be reunited. We need to take these to the department, Raymond said, gathering up the items. But Helen grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. There's more, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I've seen someone. A man, older, watching the building. He stands across the street at night, just staring up at Margaret's old apartment. Raymond's instinct was to dismiss it as paranoia, the lingering fear from the traumatic events. But something in Helen's eyes made him take her seriously. When did you last see him? He asked. Last night? She replied immediately. Around 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep, went to get some water, and there he was, just standing there in the rain. That night, Raymond parked his personal vehicle down the street from the apartment building, positioned where he could see both the entrance and the spot Helen had described. He didn't tell Morrison or anyone else at the department. If this turned out to be nothing, he didn't want to seem paranoid. But if there was even a chance that someone else was involved, he needed to know. For 3 hours, nothing happened. The street was quiet except for the occasional car passing by, the sound of rain pattering on his windshield. Then, at 2:17 a.m., he saw him. An older man, probably in his 60s, walking slowly down the sidewalk with an umbrella. The man stopped directly across from Margaret's building and stood there, looking up at the 3rd floor. Raymond watched for 15 minutes as the man remained perfectly still, rain dripping off his umbrella. There was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he seemed to be waiting for something. Finally, Raymond decided to approach. He got out of his car quietly, hand on his service weapon, and walked toward the man. "Excuse me, sir," Raymond called out when he was about 20 feet away. The man didn't startle, didn't even seem surprised. He simply turned slowly to face Raymond, and in the streetlight, Raymond could see his face clearly. The resemblance to Frank Arthur was undeniable. Not close enough to be a father, but perhaps an uncle or cousin. "Officer?" the man said calmly, his voice cultured and soft. "I suppose Helen called you." It wasn't a question. The man folded his umbrella despite the continuing rain, water immediately beginning to soak his gray hair. "I'm not doing anything illegal. Just remembering." "Remembering what?" Raymond asked, his hand still near his weapon. The man smiled, a sad expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The woman I loved. The woman who was taken from me." He looked back up at the building, first by time, then by that imposter, and finally by death. "You knew Margaret?" Raymond asked, though the evidence from Helen's discovery had already told him the answer. The man nodded. "I knew her when she was still vital, still herself, before the dementia began to take her." He paused, then added, "I tried to visit her a few years ago, but she didn't remember me. It was painful." Raymond studied the man carefully. He was well-dressed despite the late hour, wearing a suit that looked expensive even while getting soaked. His shoes were polished, his gray beard neatly trimmed. This wasn't some vagrant or confused elderly person. This was someone with means and purpose. "What's your name?" Raymond asked. The man hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. Raymond tensed, but the man simply pulled out a business card. "Dr. Simon Franklin," the card read, with an address for a psychiatric practice in Coral Gables. "I'm a psychiatrist," the man explained. Or was. "I'm mostly retired now." The name meant nothing to Raymond, but the profession sent alarm bells ringing. "How did you know Frank Arthur?" he asked directly. Dr. Franklin's expression changed, becoming harder. "That sick young man who killed my Margaret." I didn't know him, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. "He's your relative, isn't he?" Raymond pressed. "The resemblance is too strong to be coincidence." Dr. Franklin was quiet for a long moment, rain running down his face like tears. Finally, he spoke. "My nephew. My sister's son. I hadn't seen him in years, not since his mother's funeral." The pieces were starting to come together in Raymond's mind, forming a picture he didn't like. "You knew what he was doing," he said. Not a question, but a statement. Dr. Franklin's silence was answer enough. "You knew he was stalking elderly women, and you did nothing." "I didn't know he would hurt them, Doctor," Franklin said quickly, his composure cracking slightly. "Frank Arthur was always troubled, even as a child. His mother, my sister, she was difficult, demanding. She made him into what he became." He paused, wiping rain from his face. "When I heard about his activities, I thought perhaps he was working through his issues. Therapeutic in a way." Raymond felt disgust rising in his throat. Therapeutic? He was deceiving vulnerable elderly women. Dr. Franklin flinched at the accusation. "I didn't know about the others. Only Margaret. And I didn't know he had stayed after she passed until after he was arrested." "But you knew he was pretending to be her son," Raymond said. "You knew he was manipulating a vulnerable elderly woman, and you did nothing." Dr. Franklin's face showed a flash of anger. "She wasn't vulnerable when I knew her. She was brilliant, vibrant, full of life. The woman Frank Arthur knew, that wasn't my Margaret. That was just a shadow." The possessiveness in his tone was unmistakable. Raymond began to understand the full picture. Doctor. Franklin had been obsessed with Margaret for decades, watching her from afar after she rejected him. When Frank Arthur began his own obsession with elderly women, had Dr. Franklin somehow directed him toward Margaret? Or was it horrible coincidence? "I need you to come to the station," Raymond said. "We need to discuss this further." Dr. Franklin shook his head. "I've committed no crime, officer." Observing a building from a public street isn't illegal, and I had no direct involvement in my nephew's actions. He was right, technically. Without evidence that he had aided or abetted Frank Arthur's crimes, there was nothing Raymond could arrest him for. But the moral culpability was clear. This man had known on some level what was happening and had chosen to do nothing. "Did you ever try to warn Margaret?" Raymond asked. Dr. Franklin looked away. What would I have said? That my mentally ill nephew was pretending to be her dead son. She wouldn't have believed me. She barely remembered me when I tried to visit her that last time. Raymond thought about the journal entries, the decades of obsession documented in carefully preserved letters and photographs. "You've been watching her all this time," he said. "Even after she rejected you, you couldn't let go. Love doesn't simply end because it's not returned, Doctor," Franklin said, his voice taking on a clinical tone. "The emotional attachment persists, sometimes throughout a lifetime. I respected her wishes and maintained my distance, but I never stopped caring about her welfare." "And when you found out Frank Arthur was visiting her?" Raymond pressed. Dr. Franklin was quiet for a moment. "I was curious. I wanted to see what she was like with him, if she was happy. I watched them once, through the window. She was smiling, laughing at something he said. She looked content. The image was disturbing. Two men, uncle and nephew, both obsessed with the same woman, both watching her without her knowledge. One from afar, one up close. One respecting boundaries in his twisted way, the other violating them completely. "You could have stopped him," Raymond said. "You're a psychiatrist. You knew he was dangerous." Dr. Franklin's composure finally broke completely. "I didn't know she would die," he shouted, rain and tears now indistinguishable on his face. I thought maybe she could have some happiness in her final years, even if it was based on a lie." The rationalization was pathetic. The reasoning of someone who had spent so long justifying their own obsession that they couldn't see the danger in someone else's. Raymond realized that Dr. Franklin had probably seen Frank Arthur as a proxy, a way to be close to Margaret without violating the boundaries she had set. "There's something else, Doctor," Franklin said suddenly, his voice dropping back to that calm, clinical tone. "Something you should know about Frank Arthur." He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I received this a week ago." It was a letter from Frank Arthur, written from prison. Raymond recognized the handwriting immediately. "Uncle," it read, "I know you've been visiting her grave. I see you in my dreams, standing there with your flowers. She told me about you, you know. Not Margaret, Mother. She told me about your obsession with that woman, how it destroyed your marriage, your career. We're the same, you and I. The only difference is I had the courage to act." Raymond read it twice, the implications sinking in. Frank Arthur knew about his uncle's obsession with Margaret, had possibly even chosen Margaret because of it. The psychological dynamics were complex and disturbing, a nephew following in his uncle's obsessive footsteps, but taking it to a criminal extreme. "He's trying to manipulate you," Raymond said, handing the letter back. Dr. Franklin nodded. "I'm aware. It's what he does, but he's not entirely wrong. We are similar, he and I, both unable to form normal attachments, both fixated on idealized maternal figures." He paused. "The difference is, I never hurt anyone." "You hurt Margaret by stalking her," Raymond pointed out. "You hurt your family by choosing obsession over them." Dr. Franklin didn't deny it. "Yes, I suppose I did, but I never laid a hand on anyone. That's the line I never crossed." They stood there in the rain for a few more minutes, neither speaking. "Finally, Doctor," Franklin put up his umbrella again. "I'll stop coming here," he said. "Helen doesn't need to see me anymore. Let her have peace." He started to walk away, then turned back. "Officer Raymond, do you believe in evil? Real evil?" Raymond thought about Frank Arthur, about the calculated way he had deceived Margaret, and then lived with her after death. "Yes," he said simply. Dr. Franklin nodded. "So do I. And I believe it can be inherited, passed down like eye color or height. My sister had it, Frank Arthur has it. And perhaps I have it too, just more controlled." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the rainy night. Raymond stood there for a long time, processing everything he had learned. The case was closed. Frank Arthur was in prison. But the full story was so much more complex and disturbing than anyone knew. Raymond never filed a report about his encounter with Dr. Franklin. What would be the point? The man hadn't committed any crime they could prove. But Raymond did check up on him periodically. True to his word, Doctor. Franklin never returned to Margaret's building, but cemetery records showed he visited her grave every Sunday, always bringing fresh flowers. 6 months later, Raymond received another letter from Frank Arthur. "Officer Raymond," it wrote, "has my uncle been to see you? He has a story to tell, if you're willing to listen. Ask him about the others. Not Margaret's others, his. Ask him about the women who died in his care at the state hospital in the 1990s. Natural causes, they said. But Uncle taught me that natural can be helped along." Raymond investigated quietly, pulling old records from the state psychiatric hospital where Dr. Franklin had worked. There had been an unusual number of elderly female patient deaths during his tenure, but nothing that had raised red flags at the time. Elderly psychiatric patients often had multiple health issues. Their deaths weren't unexpected. But now, with the context of everything else, Raymond wondered. The final piece of the puzzle came a year later. Dr. Franklin died of a heart attack, found in his apartment surrounded by photographs of Margaret from throughout her life. In his will, he left everything to a trust for the care of elderly women with dementia. His obituary mentioned no family except a nephew currently incarcerated. Raymond attended the funeral, though he wasn't sure why. The service was small, just a few former colleagues and patients. No one mentioned Margaret or Frank Arthur. It was as if that part of Dr. Franklin's life had never existed, but Raymond knew better. He had seen the darkness that ran through that family, the obsession that had destroyed multiple lives. As he stood by Dr. Franklin's grave, Raymond thought about patterns, about inheritance, about the thin line between love and obsession. He thought about Margaret, who had died simply because she remembered the truth. He thought about Frank Arthur, sitting in a prison cell, probably planning his next letter, his next manipulation. The spring rain had started again, washing the streets of Miami clean. But Raymond knew that beneath the surface, in apartments and houses throughout the city, dangerous obsessions were growing. And somewhere, eventually, another officer would knock on another door, starting another chain of discoveries that would reveal the darkness people were capable of. The call came through at 11:34 p.m. on a sweltering July night. The kind of Miami summer evening where the humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, and even the palm trees seemed to droop with exhaustion. Officer Carroll had been patrolling the Kendall area for the past 4 hours, responding to the usual Friday night calls, noise complaints, drunken disorderlies, a few minor traffic accidents. The domestic disturbance call seemed routine at first, just another couple fighting loud enough to disturb the neighbors. Unit 451, we have a reported domestic disturbance at 8923 Southwest 142nd Street, the dispatcher announced. Neighbor reports screaming and sounds of breaking glass. Possible physical altercation in progress. Carol acknowledged the call and turned her patrol car toward the address, a middle-class neighborhood of single-family homes built in the 1980s. The kind of place where people still pretended to know their neighbors' names. The house was a typical Miami ranch-style home, painted a faded yellow with white trim that had seen better days. The lawn was neatly maintained, and there were children's toys scattered on the front porch. A bicycle with training wheels, a deflated soccer ball, chalk drawings on the concrete that the afternoon rain hadn't quite washed away. Everything looked normal from the outside, but Carol had learned long ago that domestic violence didn't discriminate based on curb appeal. As she pulled up to the house, Carol noticed that all the lights were on inside, unusual for nearly midnight. Through the front window, she could see shadows moving, but couldn't make out specific figures. She called for backup as standard procedure dictated, though Officer Gerald was at least 10 minutes away, dealing with a bar fight on the other side of the district. Carol approached the front door carefully, her hand resting on her service weapon while she knocked firmly. "Miami Police Department," she announced in a clear, authoritative voice. "We received a call about a disturbance. I need someone to open the door." For a moment, there was complete silence from inside, then she heard footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, Linda, according to the information dispatch had provided. She was wearing a light blue sundress that was torn at the shoulder, and there was a fresh bruise forming on her left cheekbone. Her dark hair was disheveled, and Carol could see what looked like defensive wounds on her forearms, the kind of marks people get when they raise their arms to protect their face. "Officer, I'm sorry about the noise," Linda said, her voice strained but attempting to sound casual. "Everything's fine now, just a little disagreement that got out of hand." She tried to smile, but Carol could see her hands trembling as she held the door. Behind Linda, the living room was in disarray. A lamp knocked over, picture frames on the floor, what looked like the remains of a dinner plate scattered near the coffee table. "Ma'am, I need to come in and make sure everyone is safe," Carol said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Is anyone else in the house?" Linda hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder before nodding slowly. "Just my daughter, Emma. She's in her room. She's fine, just scared from the yelling." Carol stepped inside, her trained eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The living room told a story of violence, not just from tonight, but from multiple incidents. There were patched holes in the drywall, the kind made by fists. The carpet had several stains that looked like they could be from various spills, cleaned but not completely removed. On the mantel, family photos showed Linda, a young girl who must be Emma, and a man, presumably the husband, all smiling in happier times. "Where's your husband, Linda?" Carol asked, though she noticed Linda flinch at the question. "He's not here," Linda replied quickly, too quickly. "He left after we argued. Went to cool off, probably at his brother's place." She was lying, Carol could tell. Years of experience had taught her to recognize the signs, the way Linda kept glancing toward the hallway, the forced casualness in her voice, the way she positioned herself as if blocking Carol's view. "I need to check on Emma," Carol said, moving toward the hallway. Linda stepped in front of her, panic flashing in her eyes. "She's sleeping. Please, I don't want to wake her. She has summer camp tomorrow and she needs her rest." But even as Linda spoke, Carol could hear a small voice from down the hall, a child's whisper carrying in the quiet house. "Mommy? Is it safe now?" The voice was tiny, frightened. Carol's protective instincts kicked in immediately. She gently but firmly moved past Linda and walked down the hallway. The first door on the right was slightly open, and Carol could see a nightlight casting soft shadows on pink walls covered with princess posters. Emma was sitting on her bed, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Her eyes were red from crying, and she was wearing frozen pajamas that were too small for her, the sleeves ending several inches above her wrists. When she saw Carol's uniform, her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and hope. "Hi, Emma," Carol said softly, crouching down to be at eye level with the child. "I'm Officer Carol. I'm here to make sure you and your mommy are okay. Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere?" Emma shook her head, but kept glancing past Carol toward the hallway, as if watching for something or someone. Linda appeared in the doorway, her anxiety palpable. "Emma, sweetie, tell the officer you're fine. Tell her everything's okay." There was desperation in Linda's voice, and Emma looked confused, torn between what her mother was asking and what she clearly wanted to say. Carol had seen this too many times. Children caught between loyalty to their parents and their own fear. "Linda, I need you to step back into the living room," Carol said, standing up. "I need to speak with Emma alone for a moment." Linda started to protest, but Carol's tone brooked no argument. Reluctantly, Linda retreated, though Carol could hear her hovering just outside the door. Once Linda was gone, Emma seemed to relax slightly. "Emma," Carol said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed, "you're not in any trouble, and neither is your mom. But I need to know what happened tonight. Can you tell me?" Emma clutched her rabbit tighter, then whispered, "Daddy was really angry. He was yelling and throwing things." "Where is your daddy now?" Carol asked, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. Emma's eyes darted toward her closet, then back to Carol. It was a tiny gesture, but Carol caught it. She stood slowly, her hand moving to her radio to quietly update her position, then walked toward the closet. "Emma, is there something you want to show me in your closet?" Carol asked. Emma shook her head vigorously, but her eyes were wide with fear. Carol reached for the closet door handle, and that's when she heard Linda's voice from the hallway, high and panicked. "Please, officer, don't." He can't." Linda's words were cut off by the sound of the closet door flying open from the inside. But instead of a man bursting out as Carol expected, the closet was empty except for children's clothes and toys. However, the back wall of the closet had been roughly cut away, creating a crude opening into what looked like another room. Carol drew her weapon, ordering Linda to stay back and Emma to stay on the bed. She called for immediate backup, then carefully approached the opening. It led into what should have been the garage, but as Carol peered through, she could see it had been converted into something else entirely. The space was dimly lit by a single bare bulb, and she could smell something chemical, like cleaning supplies mixed with something else, something organic. "Whoever is in there, this is the Miami police," Carol announced. "Come out slowly with your hands visible." There was no response, but she could hear breathing, heavy and labored, from somewhere in the converted space. She made the decision to enter, keeping her weapon drawn and ready. The garage had been transformed into a makeshift living space, but it was wrong in every way. There were restraints attached to the wall, a mattress on the floor that was stained, and medical supplies scattered on a folding table. Bandages, antiseptic, prescription bottles without labels. On the walls were dozens of photographs, all of Linda and Emma, taken from various angles and distances, some clearly without their knowledge. But the most disturbing thing was the man sitting in the corner. He wasn't Linda's husband from the family photos. This was someone else entirely, someone Carol didn't recognize. He was thin, gaunt even, with hollow eyes and scratches covering his arms and face. He was wearing what looked like hospital scrubs, torn and dirty, and he was holding something in his hands that Carol couldn't quite make out in the dim light. "Don't move," Carol ordered, her weapon trained on him. Put down whatever you're holding and show me your hands." The man looked up at her with an expression that was hard to read. Not anger or fear, but something like resignation mixed with relief. Slowly, he set down what he had been holding, and Carol saw it was a photo album, open to pictures of Linda's wedding. "She said I could stay," the man said, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in days. "She said if I helped her, I could stay." Carol kept her weapon trained on him while trying to process what she was seeing. This wasn't a simple domestic violence situation. This was something far more complex and disturbing. "What's your name?" Carol asked. The man laughed, a sound that was more like a cough. "She calls me her guardian angel, but that's not what I am." He looked past Carol toward the crude opening in the wall. "Is Emma okay?" I tried not to let her see. I always tried to protect her from seeing. Before Carol could respond, she heard a commotion from the house. Linda's voice shouting something incoherent, then the sound of feet running. Carol had to make a split-second decision: secure the unknown man in the garage or check on Emma. Her protective instincts won out. She backed out of the garage quickly, ordering the man not to move, and rushed back through the closet opening. Linda was in Emma's room, trying to grab the child, who was resisting. "We have to go," Linda was saying frantically. "We have to leave now, before he comes back." Carol realized Linda wasn't talking about the man in the garage. She was talking about someone else. Emma was crying, clearly terrified and confused. "Linda, stop," Carol commanded. "No one is going anywhere. Backup is on the way. We're going to sort this out, but you need to calm down and talk to me." Linda turned to face Carol, and the desperation in her eyes was mixed with something else: genuine terror. "You don't understand," Linda said, her voice breaking. "My husband will be back soon. He always comes back. And when he finds out the police were here, when he finds out about—" She gestured helplessly toward the closet. "He'll hurt us all." "He's hurt people before." Carol felt the situation spiraling beyond her control. She needed backup, but Gerald was still minutes away. She needed to secure multiple scenes, protect a child, and figure out what was really happening in this house. The man in the garage, Linda's missing husband who apparently had a history of violence, the bizarre living situation. None of it made sense yet. "Linda, I need you to sit down and tell me everything," Carol said, trying to project calm authority despite her own growing unease. "Start from the beginning. Who was the man in the garage?" Linda sank onto Emma's bed, pulling her daughter close. Emma buried her face in her mother's chest, her small body shaking with sobs. "His name is Marcus," Linda said finally. "I met him 3 months ago. He was hiding in our backyard shed, injured, scared. He said someone was after him, trying to hurt him." She paused, stroking Emma's hair. "I should have called the police then, but he begged me not to. He said the person after him had connections, that the police wouldn't be able to protect him." "So you let him stay?" Carol prompted, trying to keep Linda talking while she processed this information. Linda nodded. "At first, just for a few days, until he healed. But then my husband came home drunk one night, angrier than usual. He started hitting me and Marcus stopped him." The picture was becoming clearer, but also more disturbing. Linda had been harboring a stranger in her garage, someone who claimed to be in danger, and this stranger had become involved in her domestic situation. But there were still too many questions. Who was Marcus, really? Who was supposedly trying to hurt him? And where was Linda's husband now? "Linda, where's your husband?" Carol asked directly. Linda's face went pale. "I don't know." Marcus said he took care of it, said we were safe now." But I know my husband. He doesn't just disappear. He'll come back. And when he does—" She trailed off, pulling Emma tighter. Carol heard sirens approaching. Finally, backup was arriving. But she had a sinking feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something much darker. She looked at the frightened woman and child on the bed, thought about the strange man in the garage with his wall of photographs, and wondered what exactly she had walked into. Officer Gerald arrived within minutes, followed by 2 more patrol units. Carol quickly briefed Gerald on the situation while the other officers secured the perimeter of the house. The complexity of what they were dealing with required careful coordination. They had a potential victim of domestic violence, a child who needed protection, an unknown man hiding in a converted garage, and a missing husband with a violent history. "I'll take the garage," Gerald said, drawing his weapon. "You stay with the woman and child." Carol nodded, though something about the situation made her uneasy about splitting up. She watched Gerald disappear through Emma's closet into the makeshift opening, then turned her attention back to Linda, who was rocking Emma gently on the bed. "Linda, I need you to be completely honest with me," Carol said, pulling up a small chair to sit facing them. "Has Marcus hurt you or Emma in any way?" Linda shook her head quickly, almost defensively. "No, never. He's been protecting us. You don't understand what my husband is capable of." Emma lifted her head from her mother's chest, her young face streaked with tears. "The nice man brings me sandwiches," she whispered to Carol. "When Daddy gets mean, the nice man makes sure I have food in my room so I don't have to come out." The innocent revelation sent chills down Carol's spine. This child had been living in a house where hiding from violence was so routine that a stranger bringing her food had become normal. From the garage, Carol heard Gerald's voice, calm but commanding, followed by the sound of movement. A few moments later, Gerald emerged back through the closet, his expression grim. "The subject is cooperating," he reported. "But Carol, you need to see this. Have someone stay with them?" He nodded toward Linda and Emma. Carol called one of the other officers to watch Linda and Emma, then followed Gerald back through the makeshift opening. Marcus was now sitting on the floor with his hands cuffed behind his back, but he seemed calm, almost relieved. Gerald led Carol to the folding table she had noticed earlier, but now she could see what was on it more clearly. There were medical records, newspaper clippings, and what looked like police reports, all spread out in an organized fashion. The newspaper clippings were about missing persons cases from the past year, all men who had been reported missing in the Miami-Dade area. The medical records appeared to be from various hospitals, showing treatment for injuries consistent with abuse. "Look at this," Gerald said, pointing to one of the police reports. It was a domestic violence report from 2 years ago, but the victim's name had been blacked out with marker. The suspect's name, however, was clear: Robert Hutchinson, Linda's husband. There were multiple reports, dating back 5 years, from different addresses, with different victims' names redacted. "He's been tracking him," Carol realized, looking at Marcus. "You've been tracking Robert Hutchinson." Marcus looked up at her, his hollow eyes showing a flicker of something. Determination, maybe, or obsession. "He hurt my sister," Marcus said quietly. "Beat her so bad she never walked again. The police said there wasn't enough evidence. He walked free and found another victim." Carol felt the pieces clicking into place in her mind. Marcus was someone seeking justice for his family, someone who had been hunting an abusive man who had hurt his sister. He had tracked Robert to this house, found another victim in Linda, and had somehow inserted himself into the situation. But that still didn't explain everything. "Where is Robert now, Marcus?" Carol asked directly. Marcus was silent for a long moment, then looked toward a corner of the garage where a large storage container sat against the wall. Carol and Gerald exchanged glances, both thinking the same terrible thought. Gerald moved toward the container while Carol kept her attention on Marcus. "He came home drunk 6 nights ago," Marcus said before Gerald could open the container. "Started hitting Linda with a bottle. Emma was screaming. I couldn't let him continue." His voice was flat, matter of fact. "I did what I had to do to protect them." Gerald opened the container, looked inside for a moment, then quickly closed it again. His face had gone pale. "We need to call homicide," he said quietly to Carol, "and the medical examiner." Carol felt her stomach drop. This had gone from a domestic disturbance to a murder investigation in the span of minutes. "But there's more," Marcus continued, as if he hadn't just confessed to something terrible. "Check the dates on those missing person reports. Check the descriptions. They all match Robert's general appearance, don't they?" Carol looked at the clippings again, this time more carefully. He was right. All the missing men were roughly the same age, build, and general description as Robert Hutchinson. "What are you saying?" Carol asked, though she was beginning to understand. Marcus smiled grimly. "I'm saying Robert Hutchinson has done this before. Many times. Different names, different women, same pattern. Beat them, terrorize them. And when things get too hot, he disappears and becomes someone else." Carol thought about the implications. If Marcus was right, they weren't dealing with just a domestic abuser, but potentially a serial predator who had been operating for years under different identities. But that still didn't justify what Marcus had done. "You should have come to the police," she said. Marcus laughed bitterly. "I did. 3 years ago, after he hurt my sister. They said without proof of a pattern, without multiple victims willing to testify, there was nothing they could do." He looked at Carol directly. "So, I decided to find the proof myself. I've been tracking him for 3 years, documenting everything." Gerald had been on his radio, calling for additional units and investigators. The house was about to become a major crime scene. Carol knew they needed to get Linda and Emma out of there, away from what was about to become a circus of investigation. But first, she needed more information. "Linda knew what you did?" Carol asked Marcus. He shook his head. "Not at first. She thought Robert had just left after I confronted him. But she figured it out. She's smart, she saw the container, saw me bringing in supplies. She knew, but she didn't say anything." Carol returned to the house to find Linda holding Emma tightly, both of them crying. The officer watching them looked relieved to see Carol return. "Linda," Carol said gently, "we need to take you and Emma somewhere safe. This is now a crime scene." Linda looked up at her with haunted eyes. "Is he really gone?" Linda asked in a whisper. When Carol didn't answer immediately, Linda seemed to take that as confirmation. "I should feel bad, shouldn't I? I should feel something, but all I feel is relief." She looked down at Emma. "She's safe now. That's all that matters." Carol helped Linda pack a few bags for her and Emma, while crime scene investigators began arriving. The quiet residential street was now filled with police vehicles, their lights painting the palm trees in alternating red and blue. Neighbors had come out of their houses, standing in small groups, whispering and pointing. As Carol led Linda and Emma to a patrol car that would take them to a family crisis center, Linda stopped and turned to her. "Marcus saved our lives," she said firmly. "Whatever he did, he saved us. Robert would have hurt me eventually, worse than before. He told me so every time he hit me. Said one day he'd go too far and wouldn't be able to stop." Emma tugged on Carol's uniform. "Is the nice man in trouble?" she asked in her small voice. Carol didn't know how to answer. Technically, Marcus had committed a serious crime, but he had also potentially saved 2 lives and exposed what might be a serial predator. The moral complexity of the situation was overwhelming. The investigation that followed revealed even more disturbing details. The medical examiner confirmed that the body in the container was Robert Hutchinson, but when they ran his fingerprints, they got hits under 3 different names in 3 different states. Each identity had a history of domestic violence arrests, and each had disappeared when things got too serious. Marcus's documentation was thorough to the point of obsession. He had notebooks filled with observations, photographs of Robert taken from a distance, records of his movements. He had documented Robert's abuse of Linda with photographs taken through windows, audio recordings captured from hidden devices he had planted around the property. It was the kind of evidence that would have been inadmissible in court because of how it was obtained, but it painted a clear picture of escalating violence. The most disturbing discovery came from Marcus's personal effects. He had a wall of photographs in the garage, not just of Linda and Emma, but of other women and children, all previous victims of Robert under his various identities. Some of them were marked with red X's, and when investigators tracked them down, they discovered these were women who had died from accidents or suicides shortly after their abuser had disappeared. He was hunting a serial predator, Gerald said to Carol as they stood outside the house, watching investigators work. In his twisted way, Marcus was trying to stop someone the system couldn't catch. Carol nodded, though she felt deeply unsettled by the whole situation. The line between victim and perpetrator, between protector and predator, had become so blurred. 3 days into the investigation, something unexpected happened. Carol was at the station writing up her reports when she got a call from the family crisis center. Linda and Emma had disappeared. They had been there for 2 days, cooperating with investigators, then simply vanished during the night. Security footage showed them leaving voluntarily, getting into a car with someone whose face was obscured by a baseball cap. An alert went out, but Carol had a sinking feeling they wouldn't be found. Linda had made her choice. She was running, taking Emma away from the trauma and the investigation and the media attention that would follow. Carol couldn't entirely blame her. The system that had failed to protect Linda from Robert would now potentially prosecute her for harboring Marcus, for not reporting what had happened once she suspected it. 2 weeks later, Carol received a letter at the station, postmarked from Texas, but with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a child's drawing, a house with a sun, 3 stick figures holding hands, all smiling. At the bottom, in a child's handwriting, it said, "Thank you, Officer Carol. Love, Emma." There was no message from Linda, but Carol understood. They were safe, starting over somewhere new. Marcus's trial became a media sensation. His lawyer argued for a defense of others, claiming Marcus had acted to prevent imminent harm to Linda and Emma. The prosecution painted him as a vigilante who had taken the law into his own hands. The revelation of Robert's multiple identities and victims complicated everything. Some saw Marcus as a hero, others as a dangerous individual who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. During the trial, more victims came forward. Women from different states who had survived Robert's abuse, who had been told by police that without more evidence, nothing could be done. Each testimony painted a picture of a system that had failed repeatedly to stop a dangerous man who had learned how to exploit its weaknesses. Marcus was eventually convicted of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, the jury clearly sympathetic to his motives, if not his methods. He was sentenced to 15 years with the possibility of parole in 7. At his sentencing, he made a statement that haunted Carol. "I'm not sorry he's gone. I'm sorry I had to be the one to stop him. I'm sorry the system failed so completely that a traumatized brother had to become someone like him to save innocent lives. Carol continued to think about the case long after it was closed. She thought about Linda and Emma, somewhere out there, hopefully building a new life free from violence. She thought about Marcus, sitting in a cell, probably still convinced he had done the right thing. She thought about Robert's victims, the ones who had survived and the ones who hadn't. 6 months later, Carol was working a routine patrol when she got another domestic disturbance call. As she approached the house, she felt the familiar tension, the knowledge that she was about to walk into a situation where violence had already occurred, where she would have to make split-second decisions that could save or end lives. The woman who answered the door had a black eye and split lip. Behind her, Carol could see a man sitting on the couch, drunk and belligerent. The woman said everything was fine, just a misunderstanding. The man said his wife was clumsy, had walked into a door. It was the same story Carol had heard dozens of times. As she handled the situation, Carol thought about Marcus's words. The system wasn't perfect. It failed people every day. But vigilante justice wasn't the answer either. All she could do was her job, try to protect those who needed protecting, and hope that somewhere in the complicated machinery of law and justice, the right thing would occasionally happen. She arrested the man that night, despite the wife's protests. She connected the woman with resources, gave her the card for the crisis center. She documented everything meticulously, building a paper trail that might, eventually, lead to real consequences. It wasn't perfect, but it was what she could do within the system. A year passed. Carol had moved to a different district, but she still thought about the case. Then one day, she saw a news article about a new law being proposed, nicknamed Marcus's Law, that would make it easier to track domestic abusers who changed identities across state lines. The law was controversial, but it had support from victims' rights groups. 2 years after the night that changed everything, Carol was promoted to training officer. She was teaching a new generation of cops how to handle domestic disturbance calls when she got word that Marcus had been granted early parole. The news brought back all the memories of that sweltering July night. The discovery in the garage, the complexity of a case that had challenged everything she thought she knew about right and wrong. Marcus's release was controversial. Victims' rights groups were divided. Some saw him as a hero who had done what the system couldn't, while others worried about the precedent of celebrating vigilante justice. Carol found herself thinking about Linda and Emma again, wondering where they were, if they were safe, if they ever thought about that night. Then, 3 weeks after Marcus's release, something unexpected happened. Carol was at home on her day off when her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Marcus standing there, looking healthier than he had in the garage but still carrying that haunted look in his eyes. He was holding an envelope. "Officer Carroll," he said quietly, "I'm sorry to bother you at home. I wanted to give you this." He handed her the envelope. "It's from Linda. She asked me to deliver it if I ever got out." Carol was stunned. "You know where she is?" Marcus shook his head. "No, she sent it through a lawyer. She knew I might get parole eventually." Carol invited him in, despite her better judgment. They sat at her kitchen table, 2 people forever connected by one violent night. Marcus looked around her modest apartment, noting the commendations on the wall, the training manuals on the bookshelf. "You moved up," he observed. "That's good. The system needs people who understand complexity." "Why did you really come here?" Carol asked directly. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a folder from his bag. "Because there are others," he said simply. "Other men like Robert. I documented them all during my time tracking him. I can't do anything about them now, I'm on parole being watched. But you can. The folder contained information on 5 men, all with histories similar to Robert's pattern. Multiple identities, multiple victims, always moving before consequences caught up. Marcus had compiled their histories, their methods, their current suspected locations. It was the work of an obsessive mind, but it was also potentially valuable intelligence. This is evidence of serious crimes, Carol said, flipping through the documents. Why didn't you turn this over during your trial? Marcus smiled grimly. My lawyer said it would make me look more premeditated, more dangerous. He said to focus on the immediate threat to Linda and Emma, not the larger pattern. Carol opened Linda's letter while Marcus sat quietly. Linda's handwriting was neat, careful. Officer Carol, if you're reading this, it means Marcus survived prison. I wanted you to know that Emma and I are safe. We've built a new life far from Miami. Emma doesn't remember much from that night, which is a blessing. She's doing well in school, has friends, laughs again. I've remarried, a good man who knows our history and protects us without violence. I think about that night often. I know what Marcus did was wrong, but I also know we wouldn't be alive without him. The system failed me repeatedly. You were the first officer who actually saw what was happening, who tried to help. Thank you for that. Please don't look for us. We need to stay hidden to stay safe. But know that we're okay. More than okay. We're free. Linda. Carol felt tears prick her eyes. It was the closure she hadn't known she needed. She looked at Marcus, who was watching her carefully. She's really okay? Carol asked. Marcus nodded. The lawyer sends me updates. Emma's in middle school now, honor roll. He paused. She doesn't know about me, what I did. Linda thought it was better that way. They sat in silence for a moment, then Carol made a decision. I'll look into these men, she said, gesturing to the folder, but through proper channels. No vigilante justice. Marcus nodded. That's all I ask. I've had a lot of time to think in prison. What I did, it saved Linda and Emma, but it also destroyed part of me. The system is broken, but breaking it further isn't the answer. After Marcus left, Carol spent hours going through his documentation. The patterns were disturbing, but clear. These men had learned to exploit jurisdictional gaps, identity verification weaknesses, and the reluctance of abuse victims to testify. They were predators who had turned domestic violence into a serial crime. She brought the information to her captain, who was initially skeptical. But when they ran the names and patterns through interstate databases, they found matches. One of the men Marcus had identified was currently wanted in 3 states under different names. Another had just been arrested for assault in Orlando. But without the pattern information, he would likely get minimal sentence and disappear again. A task force was formed, quietly, to investigate what they started calling serial domestic abusers. Carol was brought on as an advisor, her experience with the Marcus case making her valuable. They developed new protocols for tracking identity changes, for linking cases across jurisdictions. It was slow work, but it was progress. 6 months into the task force's work, they got their first major success. One of the men Marcus had identified was arrested in Georgia, and with the pattern evidence, they were able to charge him with crimes in 4 states. His victims, some of whom had been in hiding for years, came forward to testify. It was a victory, but Carol couldn't help thinking about all the victims who hadn't survived long enough to see justice. One night, working late at the station, Carol got a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. It was a young woman's voice, tentative and uncertain. Officer Carol, this is Emma Hutchinson. Well, not Hutchinson anymore. Carol's heart stopped. Emma, now a teenager from the sound of her voice. "Emma, how did you get this number?" Carol asked gently. "Mom doesn't know I'm calling," Emma said quickly. "I found your name in some old papers. I needed to talk to someone who was there that night." They talked for an hour. Emma had started having nightmares, memories surfacing as she got older. Her mother had told her that her father had left, but Emma remembered more than Linda thought. She remembered the nice man in the garage, remembered the police, remembered the fear. "I looked up news articles," Emma admitted. "I know what really happened. I know Marcus stopped my father to save us." She paused. "Is it wrong that I'm grateful? That I'm glad we're safe?" Carol chose her words carefully. "Your feelings are valid, Emma. Your father was dangerous. Being glad you're safe doesn't make you a bad person." Emma asked about Marcus, about what had happened to him. Carol told her about the trial, the conviction, the parole. "He saved us," Emma said quietly. "Mom won't talk about it, but he saved us. The system didn't help. All those times Mom called the police before, nothing happened. But Marcus made us safe." After the call, Carol sat in her empty office thinking about cycles of violence, about justice and revenge, about the failures of systems and the desperate measures people take when those systems fail them. She thought about Marcus, out there somewhere on parole, probably still carrying the weight of what he'd done. She thought about Linda, trying to build a normal life while hiding from the past. And she thought about Emma, growing up with the knowledge that she was alive because someone had chosen violence to stop violence. A year later, the task force had identified and arrested 12 serial domestic abusers. The work was making a real difference, but it was also exhausting. Every case reminded Carol of that night in July, of the complexity of domestic violence, of how the system's failures pushed people to extremes. Then came the call that changed everything again. It was from a hospital in Tampa. Marcus had been admitted with severe injuries. Someone had attacked him, beaten him badly. The attacker had whispered something about justice for Robert before leaving him in critical condition. Carol drove to Tampa immediately. Marcus was in intensive care, machines keeping him alive. The doctors said he might not make it, and if he did, there would likely be lasting damage. Carol sat by his bedside, thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this point. On the second day, a woman appeared in the doorway. Carol recognized her immediately, despite the changed hair color and style. Linda. She looked older, worn down by years of hiding, but there was strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I heard on the news," Linda said simply. "I had to come." She sat on the other side of Marcus's bed, taking his hand gently. "He gave us our lives back. I couldn't let him face this alone." Emma appeared behind her mother, now a young woman of about 17. She looked like Linda, but had her father's height. The three women sat in silence, watching the machines breathe for Marcus. "Who did this?" Carol asked. Linda shook her head. "Robert had a brother. We've been running from him for years. He must have found out Marcus was released." The cycle of violence continuing, Carol thought. Revenge begetting revenge. Marcus survived, but he was changed. The injuries affected his memory, his speech. He couldn't remember details of that night in July, couldn't remember the specifics of what had happened. In a way, Carol thought, perhaps it was a mercy. He was transferred to a care facility, his parole modified to account for his condition. Linda and Emma visited him regularly, despite the risk. They had decided to stop running, to stop hiding. "We can't live in fear forever," Linda told Carol. "Marcus taught me that sometimes you have to stand and fight, even if the cost is high." The brother was eventually caught and prosecuted. During his trial, the full extent of Robert's crimes came to light. More victims, more identities, a pattern of violence stretching back 20 years. The brother had known, had helped Robert escape consequences multiple times. His attack on Marcus was part of a twisted family loyalty to a serial abuser. Carol testified at that trial too, another layer added to an already complex story. She spoke about the night of the domestic disturbance call, about finding Marcus in the garage, about the container and its terrible contents. She spoke about the task force that had grown from Marcus's documentation, about the lives saved because patterns had been identified. After the trial, Carol was approached by a publisher who wanted her to write a book about the case. She declined. Some stories, she felt, were too complex for simple narratives. There were no clear heroes or villains, just people pushed to extremes by a system that couldn't protect them. 5 years after that night in July, Carol was teaching a class on domestic violence intervention at the police academy. She used the case as a teaching tool, all names changed, details adjusted. She talked about the importance of seeing patterns, of taking domestic violence seriously, of understanding that sometimes victims take desperate measures when they feel the system has failed them. One of her students raised a hand. "But ma'am, wasn't Marcus wrong to take matters into his own hands? Couldn't he have just called the police?" Carol thought about her answer carefully. The police had been called multiple times across multiple jurisdictions. Robert had learned how to work the system. Marcus was wrong to do what he did, yes, but understanding why he did it is important for us to recognize our own failures and improve. After class, Carol drove by the house where it had all happened. New owners had bought it, painted it a cheerful blue, removed the garage conversion. Children's toys were scattered on the lawn again, but from a different family, one hopefully without the darkness that had lived there before. She thought about Emma's recent email. She was in college now, studying social work. She wanted to help domestic violence victims, to be part of the solution. She had written, "I know what Marcus did was wrong, but I also know I'm alive because of it. I want to help other women and children get free without anyone having to resort to violence." Carol kept Marcus's folder in her desk drawer, a reminder of the complexity of justice. The men he had identified were all in prison now, their victims finally free. But she knew there were others out there, men who had learned to weaponize the system's weaknesses against vulnerable women and children. Late one night, unable to sleep, Carol visited Marcus at the care facility. He didn't recognize her fully, didn't remember their connection clearly, but he smiled when she brought him tea, thanked her for visiting. The violent vigilante was gone, replaced by a gentle man with scattered memories and simple pleasures. "Do you remember Linda and Emma?" Carol asked gently. Marcus's face lit up. "Nice ladies." "They visit sometimes. The young one is in college." He didn't remember the details, didn't remember the cost. Perhaps that was its own form of justice or mercy. As Carol left the facility, she thought about the nature of heroism and villainy, about the thin lines between protector and predator, between justice and revenge. Marcus had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had taken a life to save lives. The system had failed, and in that failure, it had created both a killer and a hero in the same person. 10 years had passed since that humid July night when Officer Carol first responded to the domestic disturbance call. She was now Lieutenant Carol, heading the domestic violence unit she had helped create. The unit used protocols developed from the Marcus case, patterns identified from his obsessive documentation. It was her life's work, born from one night of moral complexity that had changed everything. But the past has a way of circling back. Carol was reviewing cold cases when a name jumped out at her from a file. Robert Hutchinson. Not the Robert who had died in Linda's garage, but another one, in a case from 1994. Same age range, same physical description, same pattern of abuse. The case had gone cold after the victim had disappeared. Carol pulled more files, going back further. She found 7 more Robert Hutchinsons, all matching the pattern, dating back to 1985. Either this was the most unlikely coincidence, or Robert had been operating far longer than anyone had realized. But the dates didn't make sense. Robert would have been a child in 1985. She called Marcus's care facility, hoping something in his damaged memory might provide a clue. Marcus was having one of his better days, more lucid than usual. When Carol mentioned the multiple Robert Hutchinsons, something flickered in his eyes. "The father," he said suddenly, the words coming out slurred but understandable. Robert talked about his father. Said he learned everything from him. Carol felt her blood run cold. Robert hadn't been the first. He had been continuing a family tradition, a generational pattern of violence and identity theft. The investigation that followed revealed something horrifying. The Hutchinson family had been doing this for at least 3 generations. Grandfather, father, son, all using the same methods, the same false identities, the same patterns of abuse. They had a network of false documents, safe houses, and even family members who helped them disappear when things got too hot. Carol brought this information to the FBI, as it was now clearly beyond local jurisdiction. The agent assigned to the case, a young woman named Sarah, was initially skeptical. But as they dug deeper, they found more evidence. Financial records showing money transfers between family members, property records under false names, even a storage unit filled with documents for creating new identities. "This is organized crime," Sarah said, looking at the evidence board they had created. "But instead of drugs or guns, they're trafficking in domestic violence." The comparison was apt. The Hutchinson family had turned abuse into a systematic operation, passed down through generations like a twisted inheritance. Linda agreed to be interviewed again, though she insisted on doing it via video call from an undisclosed location. She looked older, but stronger. Emma visible in the background, now a social worker herself. Linda revealed details she had never shared before. Robert had talked about his family, about uncles and cousins who understood him, who knew how to handle women. "He said I should be grateful," Linda recalled, her voice steady despite the difficult memories. "Said his father would have killed me already, but he was more evolved." The casual way Robert had discussed violence as a family trait was chilling. The investigation expanded. They found victims across the country, women who had survived encounters with various Hutchinson men. Some had stories dating back decades. One elderly woman in a nursing home remembered a Hutchinson from 1962, describing the same patterns, the same methods. But finding the current generation of Hutchinsons proved difficult. Robert's death had apparently triggered a family meeting of sorts. They had scattered, gone deeper underground. The brother who had attacked Marcus had been the only one caught, and he refused to give up any family members, even for a reduced sentence. Then Carol got a call that changed the direction of the investigation. It was from Emma, now 27 and working at a domestic violence shelter in Colorado. "Lieutenant Carroll," she said, her voice tense. "We have a woman here. She's running from someone named Hutchinson. Says he's Robert's cousin." Carol flew to Colorado immediately. The woman, Maria, was terrified but willing to talk. She had been with this new Hutchinson for 6 months before discovering documents that revealed his real identity. She had fled with their infant son, knowing what the Hutchinson family was capable of. "He told me I was lucky," Maria said. holding her baby close. Said his family had rules about how to properly train a woman, and he was following them exactly. She pulled out a notebook she had stolen before fleeing. He wrote everything down, just like they taught him. The notebook was a training manual of sorts, passed down through the Hutchinson family. It detailed how to select victims, how to isolate them, how to escalate violence gradually to maintain control. It was abuse turned into a science, complete with contingency plans for when victims tried to leave or when law enforcement got involved. Page 47, Maria said, pointing with a shaking finger. That's what scared me most. Carol read the page. It described what to do if a family member was killed by a victim or someone protecting a victim. The family was to scatter, wait 5 years, then resume operations in new locations with new identities. They had been following the playbook exactly. Robert's death had triggered a 5-year hiatus, but now they were starting again. The FBI used Maria's information to track down 3 more Hutchinson men operating under false identities in different states. Each arrest revealed more about the family structure, the network that supported their crimes. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Gerald, Carol's old partner from that night, had been doing his own investigation. He had tracked down Marcus's sister, the one who had been Robert's first known victim. She was in a long-term care facility, paralyzed from the waist down from Robert's beating 20 years ago. She can't speak well, Gerald told Carol, but she can write. And she's been writing everything she remembers about Robert and his family. The sister, Anne, had pages and pages of memories. Robert had been arrogant, had talked about his family while he abused her. He had told her about family reunions where the men shared stories of their conquests, where younger boys were taught the family trade. Anne's notes included an address, a ranch in rural Texas where the family allegedly gathered every 5 years. The FBI set up surveillance, and sure enough, as the 5-year anniversary of Robert's death approached, cars began arriving at the ranch. They counted 15 adult men, all matching the Hutchinson profile, along with women and children who seemed to be wives and offspring. The raid was coordinated across multiple states simultaneously. 23 members of the Hutchinson family were arrested on various charges ranging from identity fraud to assault to conspiracy. The ranch contained decades of documentation, fake IDs, victim photographs, even recordings of family meetings where they discussed their crimes like business strategies. During the trials that followed, the full scope of the Hutchinson family's crimes became clear. Over 90 years, they had victimized hundreds of women across the country. They had murdered at least 12 who had tried to leave or report them. They had raised their sons to continue the tradition, teaching them that women were property to be trained and controlled. Marcus was brought in to testify via video link from his care facility. On his good days, he could remember enough to corroborate parts of the investigation. When asked if he regretted his actions, he struggled to find words, finally managing, "Stopped the chain." For Linda, even with his damaged mind, he understood that he had broken a link in a generational cycle of violence. Linda testified in person, Emma by her side. She spoke about the fear that had defined her life with Robert, but also about the fear that came after, knowing that his family was out there, that they might come for revenge. "We lived in hiding for 10 years, she said. "But we're done hiding. These men thrive in shadows. It's time to bring them into the light." The trials lasted 2 years. Most of the Hutchinson men were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 5 years to life. But during the proceedings, something disturbing emerged. Some of the wives knew. They had known about the family tradition and had either accepted it or been too terrified to leave. Their children were being raised in this environment. absorbing these lessons. Child Protective Services got involved, removing 17 children from Hutchinson family homes. These children would need years of therapy to undo the programming they had received. Emma volunteered to work with some of them, understanding better than most what it was like to grow up in a house defined by violence. They're victims too, Emma told Carol during a break in one of the trials. These kids didn't choose to be born into this family. They need help, not punishment. It was a perspective that came from her own experience, her own journey from victim to advocate. One of the teenage boys, a 16-year-old named James, was particularly troubling. He had already shown signs of following the family pattern, had been caught stalking a classmate, but during therapy he broke down, admitting he didn't want to be like his father and uncles, but didn't know how to be anything else. Carol arranged for James to meet Marcus. It was a risky move, but she thought maybe seeing what the end point of violence looked like might help. Marcus, on one of his clear days, told James about the weight of taking a life, about how it had destroyed something in him even as it saved Linda and Emma. "I became like them, to stop them," Marcus managed to say. "Don't become them." James seemed to understand. He entered intensive therapy, eventually testifying against his own family members. It was a small victory in a sea of generational trauma. The case changed laws across the country. The Hutchinson Act made it easier to track identity changes related to domestic violence, created a national database for pattern recognition, and established harsh penalties for organized domestic abuse. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Carol retired 5 years after the Hutchinson trials ended. At her retirement party, she received a video message from Linda and Emma. They were standing in front of a house. Their house, one they owned, where they no longer had to hide. "You gave us the chance to be free," Linda said. "Not just from Robert, but from the fear that came after." Emma added, "The work you've done, the systems you've built, they're saving lives every day. Women who might have ended up like my mother, or worse. Children who might have grown up like I did. You took one terrible night and turned it into something that helps thousands." But the most unexpected guest at the party was Marcus himself. He had improved somewhat over the years, though he still struggled with memory and speech. He brought Carol a gift, a painting he had done in art therapy. It showed a broken chain with flowers growing through the gaps. "We broke it," he said simply. "The chain. Together." Carol understood. That night in July, as horrible as it had been, had started something. Marcus's violent act had exposed a pattern that might have continued for more generations. The system had failed, but from that failure, a better system had been built. After retirement, Carol wrote a training manual for domestic violence response. She included the Hutchinson case, all its complexity and moral ambiguity. She wrote about Marcus, the vigilante who became a victim, about Linda and Emma, who survived and thrived, about the Hutchinson family whose generational evil had finally been exposed. She visited Marcus regularly at the care facility. His health was declining, the old injuries and the years taking their toll. On one of her last visits, he was particularly lucid. "Do you think," he asked, struggling with each word, "that I'm evil like them?" Carol thought carefully before answering. "You did an evil thing for a good reason. They did evil things for evil reasons. That's the difference." Marcus seemed satisfied with that, closing his eyes with something like peace on his face. Marcus died 2 weeks later. At his funeral, Linda and Emma were there, along with several women who had been saved by the task force his documentation had helped create. It was a strange gathering, mourning someone who had taken a life, but had also been a savior. a victim who had become a perpetrator to stop other perpetrators. Emma gave the eulogy. "Marcus was not a hero," she said clearly. "He was a traumatized man who did a terrible thing. But that terrible thing saved my life and my mother's life. It exposed a century of systematic abuse. It led to changes that have saved countless others. I don't ask you to forgive him or celebrate him. I ask you to understand that sometimes the world breaks people in ways that make them break others. And sometimes, in that breaking, something important is revealed." Carol stood at Marcus's grave after everyone had left. She thought about that night in July, now 20 years in the past. She thought about choices made in desperation, about violence met with violence, about a system that had failed so completely that murder had seemed like the only option to a desperate man. The gravestone was simple, just Marcus's name and dates, but someone, probably Emma, had added a small plaque at the base. It read, "He broke the chain." It was, Carol thought, the most honest epitaph possible. As she walked away, Carol's phone buzzed. A new case, a domestic violence situation that showed patterns similar to the Hutchinson family. The work continued. The system was better now, but not perfect. There would always be predators finding new ways to exploit weaknesses. Always be victims needing protection. Always be complex moral decisions to make. Carol thought about the young officers she had trained, about the protocols developed from Marcus's obsessive documentation, about the laws changed because of the Hutchinson trials. That night in July had been a horror, but from it had grown something better. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. The last thing she did before fully retiring was visit the house where it had all happened. New families had lived there over the years, each unaware of the history within those walls. The garage had been rebuilt properly, the strange conversion that had hidden Marcus erased. But Carol knew the truth of what had happened there. The violence, the desperation, the terrible choice that had saved lives while destroying others. She sat in her car, looking at the house, remembering every detail of that night. The frightened child in princess pajamas, the battered woman trying to protect her, the hollow-eyed man in the garage with his wall of evidence, the container with its terrible secret. It had been the case that defined her career, that had shown her the complex reality of justice and protection. Her phone rang. It was Emma, now in her late 30s, calling to check on her. They had stayed in touch over the years, an unusual but meaningful friendship born from shared trauma. "I wanted you to know," Emma said, "I'm pregnant. My husband and I are having a son." Carol felt tears in her eyes. Life continuing, moving forward despite everything. "That's wonderful, Emma," she said. Emma paused, then added, "We're going to name him Carl. After you, because without you he would never have the chance to exist." It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when the system fails and violence seems like the only answer, there is still the possibility of something better growing from the ashes. The chain had been broken. The cycle had been interrupted. And somewhere, a new life would begin without the weight of generational violence. The leaves don't change color in Miami the way they do up north, but October still brings its own kind of transformation to the city. The oppressive summer heat finally breaks. Tourists haven't yet descended in full force, and there's something in the air that makes even veteran cops like Officer Norman feel uneasy. He'd been with Miami PD for 15 years, and October always seemed to bring out the strange calls, the ones that didn't fit neatly into any category. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday when the call came through about a suspicious vehicle parked at Bayfront Park. The caller, who identified herself as Joyce, said she'd been walking her dog when she noticed the van had been there for 3 days straight, never moving, with someone definitely inside. "I can see him through the windshield sometimes," Joyce had told dispatch. "He just sits there, but he's not homeless. The van's too nice for that." Norman acknowledged the call and drove toward the park. The street's empty except for the occasional delivery truck or early morning jogger. Miami at this hour had a different quality to it, like the city was holding its breath. The humidity was lower than it had been all summer, and a slight breeze carried the salt smell from Biscayne Bay through his open window. Bayfront Park stretched along the waterfront, its palm trees swaying gently in the pre-dawn darkness. Norman spotted the van immediately, a newer model Ford Transit, dark blue or black in the dim light, parked in the same spot where food trucks usually set up during the day. It was isolated enough to be suspicious, but visible enough that whoever was inside clearly wasn't trying to hide completely. Norman parked his patrol car about 50 feet away and observed for a moment. The van's windows were tinted, but he could make out a shape in the driver's seat, just as Joyce had described. The figure wasn't moving, might have been sleeping, but something about the stillness made Norman's instincts prickle. He'd learned to trust those instincts over the years. They'd saved his life more than once. He called in his position to dispatch, then approached the van slowly, his flashlight in one hand, while his other rested on his service weapon. The van was definitely new, maybe a year old at most, with Florida plates that he noted for later checking. There were no obvious signs of criminal activity, no drug paraphernalia visible, no weapons, nothing that would give him probable cause to search. But that feeling persisted, that sense that something was off. Norman tapped on the driver's side window with his flashlight. "Miami Police, I need you to roll down your window." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure inside stirred. The window came down about 6 inches, revealing a man's face, white, mid-40s, several days of stubble, eyes that looked like they hadn't seen proper sleep in weeks. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked. His voice was calm, educated, with just a trace of something Norman couldn't quite place. Not quite fear, not quite anger, but something else. The inside of the van smelled strange, a mixture of air freshener trying to mask something else, something chemical and sharp. "I need to see your license and registration," Norman said, shining his flashlight into the van's interior. What he saw made him pause. The van had been modified, the back filled with what looked like electronic equipment. Monitors, cables, boxes with blinking lights. It looked like a mobile surveillance unit, but not professional grade, more like something assembled by someone with knowledge but not resources. The man, who handed over a license identifying him as Arthur Brennan, seemed to notice Norman's interest in the equipment. "I'm a private investigator," Arthur said quickly. "Licensed." "I'm on a case." He fumbled for his wallet, producing a PI license that looked legitimate enough. Norman made a note to verify it later. "What kind of case has you parked here for 3 days?" Norman asked, his flashlight still scanning the van's interior. He noticed sleeping bags, empty food containers, bottles of water. Someone had been living in this vehicle. There were also photographs taped to one wall, too far away to make out clearly, but they appeared to be surveillance photos. Arthur hesitated, then said, "Insurance fraud." Subject lives in one of the condos across the street. Claims he can't work due to injury, but I'm documenting his daily activities that prove otherwise. It was a plausible explanation, the kind of work PIs did all the time. But something in Arthur's delivery felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced this answer. "Which condo?" Norman asked. Arthur gestured vaguely toward the high-rises that lined the waterfront. "The Marcus, Unit 1247. Norman made another mental note. These were the kinds of details that could be verified, and liars often trip themselves up on specifics. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Norman instructed. Arthur's expression shifted slightly, a flash of something that might have been panic quickly suppressed. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong. I have every right to be here." His hand moved slightly and Norman tensed, but Arthur was just gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I'm not arresting you," Norman explained, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I just need to verify your story and make sure everything's legal. Step out of the vehicle." After another moment's hesitation, Arthur complied, moving slowly and deliberately. He was taller than he'd appeared sitting down, maybe 6'2", wearing dark clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. As Arthur stood by the van, Norman noticed he kept glancing at something in the back, a nervous tick that most people wouldn't catch. "Is there anyone else in the vehicle?" Norman asked. Arthur shook his head quickly, too quickly. "No, just me. Like I said, surveillance work is usually a solo job." Norman walked around the van, shining his light through the windows. The equipment in the back was even more extensive than he'd first thought. There were at least 6 monitors, each showing different feeds that were currently dark. Recording equipment, hard drives, and what looked like signal interceptors, the kind of gear that went well beyond typical PI work. "This is a lot of equipment for insurance fraud surveillance," Norman observed. Arthur shifted his weight nervously. "I do other work too. Corporate stuff mostly. This case just happens to be insurance." His explanation was getting more elaborate, another red flag. Truth was usually simple. Lies required detail. "I'm going to need to call this in, verify your PI license," Norman said, reaching for his radio. Arthur's reaction was immediate and unexpected. He didn't run or fight. Instead, he started laughing. Not maniacal laughter, but tired, resigned, like someone who'd finally reached the end of a very long joke. "Go ahead," Arthur said, still chuckling darkly. "Call it in. Check everything. You won't find what you're looking for because you don't even know what you're looking for." He sat down on the curb, putting his hands on his knees in a non-threatening position. "I've been waiting for this for 3 days. 3 days of sitting in that van, and finally, someone notices." Norman kept his hand near his weapon while calling dispatch to run Arthur's information. While waiting for a response, he studied the man more carefully. Arthur didn't look like a typical criminal, or even a PI who'd stepped over the line. He looked exhausted, haunted even, like someone carrying a weight that was slowly crushing him. "What are you really doing here, Arthur?" Norman asked. Arthur looked up at him, and in the harsh beam of the flashlight, Norman could see his eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles that spoke of more than just a few sleepless nights. "I'm watching," Arthur said simply. "Someone has to watch. Someone has to know." He gestured toward the condos again. "You think you know what goes on in those buildings? Behind all that glass and steel? You have no idea what people are capable of when they think no one's looking." Dispatch came back with confirmation that Arthur's PI license was valid. No warrants, no criminal record beyond a few traffic citations. But they also mentioned something interesting. Arthur had been reported missing by his supervisor, someone named Donald Freeman, 2 weeks ago. He'd been working a case and simply vanished, taking company equipment with him. "Your boss is looking for you," Norman said. Arthur's laugh was bitter. "Donald doesn't care about me. He cares about his equipment, his reputation. He doesn't care about the truth." Arthur stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Officer, I know how this looks. Man living in a van, talking about watching people. Probably seems crazy. But I'm not crazy. I've seen something, documented something, and no one wants to believe it." Norman had heard similar claims before, usually from people suffering from paranoid delusions or drug-induced psychosis. But Arthur seemed lucid, troubled but rational. "What have you seen?" Norman asked, partly to keep him talking while backup arrived, partly out of genuine curiosity. Arthur walked back to the van and pulled out a folder from the front seat. "May I?" he asked, holding it up. Norman nodded, and Arthur opened it, revealing printed photographs. They were surveillance shots, taken with a long lens, showing various people entering and leaving the Marcus condominium. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. "Look closer," Arthur said, pointing to timestamps on the photos. "This man enters the building at 3:17 a.m. on October 2nd. He flipped to another photo. "This is the same man leaving at 3:45 a.m., but look at his posture, his gait. Something's different." Norman studied the photos. They were grainy, taken in low light, but Arthur had a point. The man leaving seemed disoriented, confused, walking differently than when he'd entered. "Maybe he was drunk," Norman suggested. "Or tired." It was the middle of the night. Arthur pulled out more photos, dozens of them, all showing similar patterns. People entering the building who seemed different when they left. Confused, disoriented, sometimes accompanied by others who hadn't been there before. "It's not just one apartment," Arthur said, his voice rising with frustration. "It's the whole 12th floor. Something's happening up there." "Why didn't you report this to the police?" Norman asked. Arthur's expression darkened. "I tried. Called it in as suspicious activity 5 days ago. Officer came out, said there was nothing he could do without evidence of a crime. So I kept watching, kept documenting." He gestured to the van. "All that equipment? It's recording everything. Everyone who goes in and out of that building." Norman's radio crackled with a message that backup was 5 minutes out. He needed to make a decision about how to handle this. Arthur hadn't committed any obvious crime, but taking company equipment and disappearing for 2 weeks wasn't exactly normal behavior. And then there was the matter of what he claimed to have witnessed. "Show me the recordings," Norman said. Arthur's face lit up with what might have been hope or relief. He climbed into the van, Norman following cautiously, and began pulling up files on one of the monitors. The screen flickered to life, showing multiple camera feeds from different angles around the building. "This is from last night," Arthur said, fingers flying over a keyboard. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. A woman entered the building, young, blonde, wearing a red dress. Arthur fast-forwarded to 12:23 a.m. The same woman left, but she seemed confused, disoriented, being helped by someone in medical scrubs. "Could be a medical emergency," Norman suggested, though something about it seemed off. Arthur pulled up more footage, instance after instance of people entering normally and leaving in various states of confusion or distress, often with people in medical attire. "There's more," Arthur said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. He pulled up a different file, this one showing the building's parking garage. "Watch this." A black sedan pulled in at 2:15 a.m. Arthur fast-forwarded to 4:45 a.m. The same car left, but the driver was clearly different. The original driver had been alone, but now there were 2 people in the car. "What do you think is happening?" Norman asked. Arthur turned to face him fully. "I think someone's running an illegal medical facility up there. Maybe organ harvesting. Maybe illegal drug trials. People go in for what they think is one thing and come out changed." Norman's radio crackled again. Backup had arrived. He could see another patrol car pulling up behind his. He needed to make a decision quickly. Either Arthur was seeing patterns where none existed, Or he had stumbled onto something genuinely criminal. "I need you to step out of the van again," Norman said. "My supervisor's going to want to see this." Arthur's face fell. "You're not going to take this seriously, are you? You're going to write me off as another paranoid person, have Donald come get his equipment, and pretend none of this is happening." Before Norman could respond, something caught his eye on one of the monitors. The live feed from the building's entrance showed someone exiting, someone Norman recognized. It was Joyce, the woman who had called in the suspicious vehicle complaint. But she hadn't mentioned living in the building. She'd said she was walking her dog. Norman stared at the monitor, watching Joyce walk away from the building with a casual stride that seemed at odds with someone who'd just called in a suspicious vehicle. Arthur noticed his attention and pulled up the recorded footage from earlier. "She called at 3:47, right?" Arthur said, fingers moving across the keyboard. "But look, here she is, leaving the building at 3:31. The timestamp was clear. Joyce had left the Marquise 16 minutes before calling about the suspicious van. Norman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "Maybe she lives nearby," he said, though something in his gut told him this was connected to whatever Arthur had uncovered. The backup officer appeared at the van's rear doors, shining his flashlight inside. It was Supervisor Donald Morrison, a 20-year veteran who Norman respected. "What do we have here, Norman?" Donald asked, his voice carrying the weight of too many late-night calls. "PI who's been conducting surveillance," Norman replied, but Arthur interrupted. "It's more than that. I've documented something happening in that building. People are going in for medical procedures and coming out different. I think it's an illegal medical facility." Donald's expression remained neutral, but Norman could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Mr. Brennan," Donald said, reading from his notepad, "your employer reported you missing 2 weeks ago. You took company equipment without authorization. That's theft." Arthur's hands clenched into fists, but he kept them at his sides. "Donald Freeman knows exactly what's happening in that building. He's been paid to look the other way." It was a serious accusation, one that made both officers tense. "That's a serious claim," Donald said, stepping closer to the van. "Do you have evidence to support it?" Arthur pulled up another file on his computer, showing surveillance footage from 2 weeks prior. It showed Donald Freeman entering the Marquis building at 1 a.m., staying for an hour, then leaving with an envelope. Norman and Donald exchanged glances. The supervisor's expression had shifted from skepticism to something else. Concern, maybe, or calculation. "Mr. Brennan, I think you need to come to the station," Donald said. "We'll sort this out there." But his tone suggested this wasn't really a request. Arthur backed away from them, his eyes darting between the two officers. "You already know, don't you?" he said, his voice rising. "You know what's happening in there and you're covering it up." His hand moved toward something in the van, and both officers tensed. "Don't do anything stupid," Norman warned, his hand moving to his service weapon. Arthur laughed, that same bitter, exhausted sound from earlier. "Stupid? I've been sitting in this van for 3 days, watching people being exploited, and you think I'm the one being stupid?" He pulled out what he'd been reaching for. Not a weapon, but a hard drive. "Everything's on here," he said, holding it up. 2 weeks of surveillance, every person who went in and came out different. I have copies hidden, so destroying this won't help. He tossed it to Norman, who caught it instinctively. "There's something else you need to see," Arthur said, his voice dropping. He pulled up another monitor, this one showing what looked like financial records. "The 12th floor is registered to a company called Renewal Medical Services. They claim to offer experimental treatments for neurological conditions, but they're not licensed, they're not regulated, and they're paying off officials to stay operational. Donald stepped forward, studying the records with an expression Norman couldn't read. "This could be legitimate medical research," Donald said finally. "Experimental doesn't mean illegal." But his voice lacked conviction, as if he was trying to convince himself. "Then explain this," Arthur said, pulling up his final piece of evidence. It was internal security footage from the building, somehow obtained. It showed a hallway on the 12th floor, medical equipment visible through open doors. But what caught Norman's attention were the patients. They all seemed to be homeless people, drug addicts, people who wouldn't be missed. "They're targeting vulnerable populations," Arthur said. "People who won't be looked for if something goes wrong." And something is going wrong. These people come out different. Memory problems, personality changes. Sometimes they don't even recognize their own names. Norman's radio crackled with an urgent message. Multiple units were being dispatched to the Marquis building for a reported medical emergency on the 12th floor. But as they looked at the building, there was no sign of ambulances or emergency vehicles yet. "It's happening now," Arthur said immediately. "They know I've been watching. They're evacuating." Sure enough, people began streaming out of the building, far more than should have been there at 4:30 in the morning. Norman counted at least 50 people leaving, some in medical scrubs, others looking like patients in various states of confusion. "We need to get up there," Norman said, but Donald grabbed his arm. "We don't have probable cause, no warrant. We need to do this properly." But Norman could see something in Donald's eyes, not skepticism anymore, but fear. Whatever was happening in that building, Donald knew more than he was saying. Arthur was typing frantically on his computer. "I'm uploading everything to cloud storage," he muttered. "If something happens to me, at least the evidence will survive." He looked up at Norman. "You believe me now, don't you?" You can see something's wrong here. Norman did see it. The patterns were too consistent to ignore. But without hard evidence of a specific crime, their hands were tied. Then Joyce appeared again, walking quickly toward them. But as she got closer, Norman noticed something off about her. She seemed confused, disoriented, not like the confident woman who had called in the complaint. "Officers," Joyce said, and her voice was different, uncertain. I'm sorry for calling. I don't know why I did that. Everything's fine." She looked at Arthur with no recognition, despite having specifically reported his van. "I should go home. I don't feel well." Arthur stood up quickly. "Joyce, what did they do to you? You called about my van an hour ago. You knew I was here." Joyce looked at him blankly. "I don't know you. I don't remember calling anyone." She touched her head gingerly. "I have such a headache." "When did you go into the building?" Norman asked directly. Joyce looked confused. "Building? I don't remember. I was walking my dog, and then..." She trailed off, looking lost. "Where's my dog?" Donald's radio came to life with a message from dispatch. The fire department had arrived at the Marquis but found no emergency. However, they had discovered that the entire 12th floor had been hastily evacuated. Medical equipment was left behind, patient files scattered, clear signs of a rapid departure. "They cleared out," Arthur said, his voice defeated. "All my surveillance, all my evidence, and they still got away." But Norman was looking at Joyce, who was swaying slightly on her feet. Whatever had been done to her, she needed medical attention. "Joyce, we're going to get you to a hospital," Norman said. "You need to be checked out." Joyce nodded weakly, not protesting. As Norman called for an ambulance, he noticed Donald on his phone, speaking quietly but urgently to someone. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics examined Joyce and found injection marks on her arms, signs of recent medical procedures. Her pupils were dilated, her reflexes abnormal. "Looks like she's been given some kind of experimental drug," one paramedic said. "We need to run tests." As Joyce was taken away, Arthur turned to Norman. "This is bigger than just one building," he said. "Donald Freeman has connections to similar operations in other cities. They're using desperate people as test subjects for unregulated medical procedures." Norman looked at the hard drive in his hand, then at Donald, who was still on his phone. "Donald," he said, "we need to report this to federal authorities. This is beyond our jurisdiction." Donald ended his call and turned to them. "Already done," he said, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't calling who Norman thought. "FBI will be here within the hour. They'll want to see all the evidence." Arthur laughed bitterly. "FBI? Or more people on the payroll? How deep does this go, Supervisor?" Donald's expression hardened. "Deep enough that you should be careful, Mr. Brennan. You've stumbled into something dangerous." Before anyone could respond, black SUVs pulled up to the scene. Men in suits emerged, but they didn't look like FBI. They moved with military precision, surrounding the van and Arthur. One of them approached Donald and showed him credentials that Norman couldn't see clearly. "We'll take it from here," the man said. "This is a matter of national security." Norman felt his stomach drop. National security? What had Arthur really uncovered? "These are the federal agents I called," Donald said, but Norman could see the lie in his eyes. These weren't FBI. They were something else. Something that operated in shadows and made problems disappear. Arthur was backing away slowly. "They're going to bury this," he said to Norman. "All those people, all those victims, and no one will ever know." The suited men moved closer, their intentions clear. "Mr. Brennan, you need to come with us," one of them said. "You've been conducting illegal surveillance. You've stolen proprietary medical information. You're in serious trouble." Norman had to make a choice. Follow protocol and let these men take Arthur, possibly never to be seen again, or intervene and risk his career, maybe his life. He looked at the hard drive in his hand, thought about Joyce's confusion, about all those vulnerable people Arthur had documented. "I need to see proper identification," Norman said, stepping between Arthur and the suited men. "This is still Miami PD jurisdiction until I verify your authority." The lead suit reached for something, and Norman tensed, but it was just a phone. "Officer Norman," a voice said from the phone. It was the chief of police. "Stand down. These men have full authority. Give them all evidence and forget this night happened." Norman recognized the voice, but something was wrong. The chief never worked nights, and he would never tell an officer to forget evidence. "Sir, I need to verify this is really you," Norman said. There was a pause. Then the voice said something only the real chief would know, a detail from Norman's commendation ceremony 5 years ago. It was really him, but he sounded strained, forced. "Understood, sir," Norman said. But he palmed the hard drive while pretending to hand it over, giving them an identical blank one from his pocket instead. The suited men seemed satisfied, and they moved to take Arthur. "Wait," Norman said. "Mr. Brennan is a witness in an ongoing investigation. I need him to come to the station to give a formal statement." The suited men exchanged glances, then their leader made a phone call. After a brief conversation, he nodded. "You have 1 hour. Then we take custody. It was better than nothing." Norman quickly got Arthur into his patrol car, with Donald following in his vehicle. As they drove, Arthur said quietly, "Thank you." You just saved my life. They would have made me disappear like the others." Norman glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Others?" "3 other PIs who investigated that building," Arthur said. "All missing, all their evidence destroyed. I only survived this long because I stayed mobile, stayed hidden." He paused. "Officer Norman, what I documented is real. They're doing human experimentation, memory manipulation, personality modification. They're trying to create a way to reprogram people." Norman thought about Joyce, about her sudden confusion and memory loss. "Why? What's the purpose?" Arthur shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe military applications, maybe something else. But they're using Miami's homeless and addicted as test subjects, people who won't be missed, whose personalities can change without anyone noticing." They arrived at the station, but Norman noticed black SUVs already in the parking lot. They had less time than promised. He quickly took Arthur to an interrogation room and started recording his statement, making sure to create official documentation that couldn't easily disappear. Arthur spoke quickly, knowing their time was limited. He gave names, dates, locations. He described the patterns he'd observed, the victims he'd identified. He talked about Donald Freeman's involvement, the payoffs, the cover-ups. It was all being recorded, creating a record that would be hard to completely erase. 40 minutes into the statement, the door opened. The suited men were there, along with Donald and the chief of police himself. The chief looked tired, defeated. "That's enough, Officer Norman. These men are taking Mr. Brennan into federal custody." Norman stood up. "Sir, his statement isn't complete. This is a potential mass victimization case. We have a duty to investigate." The chief's expression was pained. "Officer Norman, some things are beyond our jurisdiction. Sometimes we have to trust that the right people are handling it." But his eyes said something different. They said he was sorry, that his hands were tied. Arthur was led away, but as he passed Norman, he whispered, "Check your pocket." Norman felt the small USB drive Arthur had somehow slipped him. Another backup, another copy of the evidence. After everyone left, Norman sat alone in the interrogation room. He had the recording of Arthur's statement, the hidden hard drive, and now this USB. Evidence of something huge, something that powerful people wanted hidden. But what could one cop do against such forces? He thought about Joyce. Probably in a hospital now, her memories scrambled. He thought about all those vulnerable people Arthur had documented, used as test subjects for God knows what. He thought about his oath to protect and serve. Norman made a decision. He couldn't fight the system directly, but he could make sure the evidence survived. He made multiple copies of everything: Arthur's statement, the surveillance footage, the documentation of victims. He hid copies in different places, sent encrypted files to trusted contacts outside the department, even mailed a USB drive to a journalist he knew. The next morning, Norman was called into the chief's office. The chief looked older than he had the night before, worn down by whatever pressure he was under. "Officer Norman," he began, "last night never happened. There was no suspicious vehicle, no P. I named Arthur Brennan, no investigation. Is that clear?" Norman met his eyes steadily. "Sir, there are victims. People who've been experimented on. Joyce is in the hospital right now with neurological damage." The chief's jaw tightened. "Joyce had a stroke. That's the official diagnosis. She's receiving excellent care, all expenses paid by an anonymous benefactor." "A stroke at her age?" Norman challenged. "With injection marks and surgical scars?" The chief stood up, his patience clearly exhausted. "Officer Norman, you're a good cop. Don't throw your career away over something you don't understand. Some battles can't be won." Norman stood as well. With all due respect, sir, I took an oath to protect and serve. Those people Arthur documented. They need protection. The chief's expression softened slightly. And they're getting it. The facility has been shut down. The victims are receiving medical care. The perpetrators are being dealt with. Just not publicly. Dealt with how? Norman asked. The chief shook his head. That's not our concern. Our concern is maintaining order in Miami, keeping the peace. Sometimes that means accepting that other agencies handle certain problems. Norman left the office understanding the message clearly. Drop it or lose everything. But he couldn't forget what he'd seen, what Arthur had documented. He decided to investigate quietly, on his own time, carefully. Over the next weeks, Norman tracked down some of the homeless people Arthur had photographed entering the building. Many were missing, but he found a few. They all had similar stories. Approached by people offering money for medical trials, promised good pay and medical care. They'd gone to the 12th floor of the Marquise, undergone procedures they didn't fully understand, and left with gaps in their memory and changes in their personality. One man, Carl, was particularly lucid. They said they were testing Alzheimer's treatments, he told Norman. Said they could improve memory, make us smarter. But after the procedures, I couldn't remember my own daughter's name for weeks. Still have trouble sometimes. Did you report this? Norman asked. Carl laughed bitterly. To who? I'm homeless. Who's going to believe me over doctors in suits? He had a point. The victims were chosen specifically because they had no credibility, no one to advocate for them. Norman compiled all his findings into a detailed report, but he knew he couldn't file it officially. Instead, he sent it to the journalist, along with Arthur's evidence. Maybe public pressure could accomplish what the system wouldn't. 2 days later, Norman arrived at work to find his locker cleaned out and a termination notice on his desk. The reason given was conduct unbecoming an officer, but no specifics were provided. The chief wouldn't see him, and his fellow officers avoided him like he had a disease. Donald was the only one who spoke to him, catching him in the parking lot. You should have listened, Donald said. You could have had a long, successful career. Instead, you threw it away for people who don't matter. Everyone matters, Norman replied. That's what the badge is supposed to mean. Donald shook his head. The badge means you follow orders, maintain order. You forgot that. Norman turned in his gun and badge, feeling strangely relieved. He'd lost his career, but he'd kept his integrity. As he walked to his car, his phone rang. It was the journalist. Norman, I got your package, she said. This is huge. I'm going to run the story, but I need you on record. Are you willing to go public? Norman thought about the consequences. The powerful people who wanted this buried. The danger he'd be putting himself in. Then he thought about Joyce, confused and frightened in the hospital. About Carl, struggling to remember his daughter. About Arthur, who'd risked everything to expose the truth and had disappeared into federal custody. Yes, he said, I'll go on record. The story broke 3 days later. Illegal human experimentation in Miami, a cop's quest for justice. It detailed everything. The vulnerable populations targeted, the memory manipulation experiments, the cover-up that went all the way to the top. Norman's evidence was irrefutable. Arthur's surveillance footage shocking. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Protests formed outside the Marcus building. Families of missing homeless people demanded answers. Medical ethics boards called for investigations. The story went national, then international. But the backlash was swift, too. Norman started receiving death threats. His apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen, a warning. He was followed constantly, sometimes by people in suits, sometimes by others who were harder to identify. Then, unexpectedly, he received a call from a blocked number. "Officer Norman?" The voice was familiar but weak. It was Arthur. "Arthur?" "Where are you?" Norman asked, relieved to hear he was alive. "Federal facility. They're treating me well enough, but I'm not free to leave. They say it's for my protection." Arthur coughed. "I heard about the story. Thank you for not letting it die. What really happened up there, Arthur? What were they trying to do?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. "They were trying to rewrite people, Norman. Not just their memories, but their entire personalities. Make them more compliant, more controllable. The homeless were just test subjects. The real targets were going to be others, protesters, dissidents, anyone who challenged the system." Norman felt a chill. That's why they shut it down so fast. Not to protect the victims, but to hide the evidence. Exactly. "And there are other facilities, Norman, in other cities. Miami was just one node in a network." Arthur's voice dropped. "Be careful. They're watching you. The story has made you too visible to disappear, but that won't protect you forever." The call ended abruptly. Norman tried calling back, but the number was dead. He'd probably never hear from Arthur again. Over the following months, there were official investigations, but they went nowhere. The 12th floor of the Marquise had been completely sanitized. All medical equipment was gone, all records destroyed. The company, Renewal Medical Services, had dissolved overnight. Its assets transferred to shell companies that led nowhere. Joyce recovered partially but never fully. She had permanent memory problems, confusion that came and went. She sued, but the defendants couldn't be found. The corporation didn't exist anymore, and the individuals behind it had vanished like smoke. Norman found work as a private investigator, using the skills he'd learned as a cop. He specialized in helping vulnerable populations, the homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill. People who might be targeted because no one would believe them. One day, 6 months after losing his badge, Norman received a package with no return address. Inside was a hard drive and a note in Arthur's handwriting. "They moved me to a new facility. I managed to copy this before they cleaned out my system. 12 more cities. Same pattern. The story isn't over." The hard drive contained surveillance footage from other cities: Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston. The same pattern Arthur had identified in Miami. Vulnerable people entering buildings, leaving changed. Different companies, but the same operation. Norman knew he couldn't fight this alone. He reached out to other journalists, other former cops who'd been pushed out for asking too many questions. Slowly, a network formed. People dedicated to exposing these operations, protecting the vulnerable. Donald visited him once, late at night. Norman found him sitting in his living room when he came home, having let himself in somehow. "You're making powerful enemies," Donald said. "They've been patient because the publicity protects you, but that won't last forever." "Are you threatening me?" Norman asked. "I'm warning you." I didn't agree with what they were doing, but I understood the necessity of order, control. You're creating chaos. Donald stood to leave. "They're going to try again, you know. Not here, not the same way, but somewhere. The technology is too valuable to abandon. Then I'll stop them again," Norman said. Donald smiled sadly. "You can't stop progress, Norman. You can only delay it." He left, and Norman never saw him again. 2 weeks later, the news reported that Supervisor Donald Morrison had died in a car accident. The details were suspicious, but the investigation was perfunctory. Norman understood the message. Those who knew too much even those who cooperated, were liabilities. He increased his security, varied his routines, but he knew it was only a matter of time. A year later, Norman was investigating a similar operation in Atlanta when he met Dr. Patricia Vance, a neuroscientist who'd been recruited for the memory experiments but had refused to participate when she learned the truth. "They told me it was to help Alzheimer's patients," she said. "Revolutionary treatment that could restore lost memories. It wasn't until I saw the test subjects that I realized what they were really doing." "What were they doing?" Norman asked. "Creating blank slates. Erasing personalities so they could be rewritten. The memory loss was intentional, not a side effect. They wanted to create people who would follow orders, without question, who could be programmed for specific tasks. Like sleeper agents? Worse. Like biological robots. People who looked human, acted human, but had no free will. The perfect workforce, the perfect soldiers, the perfect citizens." She shuddered. "I destroyed my research and ran. They've been looking for me ever since." Norman helped Dr. Vance disappear, giving her a new identity, a new life. In return, she gave him something invaluable, the scientific knowledge to understand what he was fighting. Together, they documented the signs of memory manipulation, created tests to identify victims, developed treatments to help recovery. The work was dangerous. 3 journalists who'd covered the story died in accidents. 2 other former cops who'd been investigating disappeared. Norman knew he was living on borrowed time, but he couldn't stop. Every victim he helped, every operation he exposed, was a small victory against a vast machine. 5 years after that night at Bayfront Park, Norman received another message from Arthur. This time, it was a video file. Arthur looked older, grayer, but alive. He was in what looked like a hospital room. "Norman," Arthur said to the camera, "if you're seeing this, it means I finally found a way to get a message out. I'm not in federal custody anymore. I'm in one of their facilities. Not as a prisoner, but as a test subject. They're using me to perfect their techniques." Arthur held up his arm, showing surgical scars. "They've been mapping my brain, trying to understand how I was able to uncover their operation. They want to create people who can think like me, but who they can control. I don't have much time. They'll discover this soon, but I needed you to know, Joyce wasn't random. She was chosen because she saw something she shouldn't have. A city official being brought in for treatment. They tried to erase her memory of it, but the process was imperfect. Norman, they're not stopping, they're refining. The next generation of this technology won't leave obvious signs. People won't come out confused. They'll come out exactly as programmed, and no one will know the difference. Keep fighting. Keep watching. And Norman, check the Miami City Council. 3 members have been through the program. They don't even know it themselves." The video ended. Norman tried to trace its origin, but it had been routed through so many proxies it was impossible. He investigated the city council members Arthur had mentioned and found subtle signs, small personality changes, voting patterns that had shifted, memories that didn't quite align with records. Norman knew he couldn't investigate the city council members directly. It would be too dangerous and might tip off whoever was running the program. Instead, he focused on helping the victims he could find, documenting everything, building an undeniable case that someday, somehow, would see the light of day. Dr. Vance, working under her assumed name, had developed techniques to help victims recover their memories. It wasn't perfect. Some damage was permanent, but many people were able to reclaim at least part of who they'd been before the procedures. One of those people was Carl, the homeless man Norman had interviewed. With Dr. Vance's help, Carl recovered enough of his memories to remember that he'd once been a computer programmer, had a family, a life. The experiments had stolen years from him, but not everything. "I want to help," Carl told Norman one day. "I know these people, the homeless community. They trust me. I can warn them, tell them what to watch out for." And so their network grew. Former victims became advocates, warning others, watching for signs of new operations. The journalist who'd broken the original story continued investigating, despite the dangers. Other cities began reporting similar patterns, and slowly, public awareness grew. But so did the pushback. New laws were passed making it harder to investigate medical facilities. Privacy laws that supposedly protected patients actually shielded illegal operations. Whistleblowers were prosecuted while the perpetrators remained free. Norman received another video from Arthur. This one more disturbing. Arthur looked terrible. Thin, pale, his eyes unfocused. "They're accelerating the program," he said weakly. "Not just memory manipulation now, they're working on remote influence. Electromagnetic fields that can alter brain chemistry from a distance. No need for procedures anymore. They can change people without them even knowing. I volunteered for the experiments," Arthur continued, his voice breaking. "Told them I'd cooperate if they'd leave you and the others alone. But they lied. They're still watching you all, still planning. Norman, I'm dying. The experiments have damaged my brain beyond repair. But I needed you to know the truth. Check the new 5G towers going up around Miami. They're not just for phones. They're part of the infrastructure for mass influence. Small changes at first, mood alterations, increased suggestibility. But eventually, the video cut off. Norman investigated the towers Arthur mentioned and found they were indeed different from standard cell towers. They had additional equipment, drew more power, and were positioned in patterns that didn't make sense for cellular coverage, but did make sense if you were trying to blanket populated areas with specific electromagnetic frequencies. He tried to report it, but who would believe him? A disgraced ex-cop talking about mind control towers. He'd sound like every conspiracy theorist on the internet. But he documented everything anyway, adding it to his growing archive of evidence. Dr. Vance studied the tower specifications Norman had gathered. "It's theoretically possible," she said reluctantly. "The brain operates on electrical impulses. If you could generate the right frequencies, you could influence mood, decision-making, even memories. But the power requirements would be enormous. Unless they're not trying to control everyone," Norman said. "Just influence them. Make them more compliant, less likely to question authority, more accepting of surveillance and control." They began mapping the towers, correlating their locations with reported changes in behavior patterns. It was subtle, but there were signs. Areas with the new towers showed decreased protest activity, increased consumer spending, higher rates of antidepressant use. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, but a clear pattern if you knew what to look for. One night, Norman was reviewing footage when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Joyce, poor, confused Joyce, had been visiting the same medical clinic every week since her stroke. But in the footage, she seemed different after each visit. More focused, more normal, but also somehow less herself. He investigated the clinic and found it was owned by a subsidiary of a company that had connections to the original Renewal Medical Services. They hadn't stopped, they'd just gotten better at hiding. Norman confronted Joyce, carefully, gently. "Do you remember calling about my van?" he asked. She looked at him blankly at first. Then something flickered in her eyes. Sometimes I have dreams," she said slowly, "about watching someone in a van, about being scared. But the doctors say those are false memories, trauma from the stroke. What if they're not false? Norman asked. What if the stroke was a cover story? Joyce started crying. I don't know what's real anymore. Every week they help me, they say. They're fixing my brain. But sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing, like the real me is being erased piece by piece. Norman helped Joyce escape the program, though he knew it meant burning another bridge, making another enemy. Dr. Vance worked with her, trying to preserve what was left of her original personality. It was heartbreaking work. Joyce would recover memories only to lose them again, her brain damaged by repeated procedures. Years passed. Norman aged, grew tired, but couldn't stop. The network of resistance grew, but so did the program. It spread like a virus, each city a new infection point. The technology evolved, became more sophisticated. The new subjects didn't come out confused anymore. They came out perfect, perfectly compliant, perfectly productive, perfectly controlled. Norman received one final message from Arthur, not a video this time, but a simple text. They're ending the experiment. Moving to implementation. Check the water supply. Norman investigated and found trace amounts of neurological compounds in Miami's water system. Not enough to cause obvious effects, but enough to make people more susceptible to the electromagnetic influences. The population was being primed without their knowledge. He tried to go public with this information, but now he really did sound like a conspiracy theorist. The journalist who'd supported him was dead. Suicide, they said, though Norman knew better. Dr. Vance had vanished, either captured or fled. Carl had been arrested on trumped-up charges and was in a psychiatric facility where no one would believe his delusions. Norman was alone, his evidence dismissed, his credibility destroyed. But he kept fighting, kept documenting, kept warning anyone who would listen. He became the crazy old man on the street corner, holding signs about mind control and government experiments. People laughed, walked past, never knowing he was trying to save them. One day, a young police officer approached him. Officer Sarah Chen, fresh out of the academy, idealistic and eager. Mr. Norman, she said quietly, I've read about you. About what you tried to expose. Norman looked at her suspiciously. Was she real or another trap? And, I believe you, she said simply. I've seen things. Patterns. People changing, my own. Wandered off. Dementia finally claiming his troubled mind. But Sarah knew better. She found one last message from him, hidden in a place only she would look. They came for me, but I got this out first. The program is complete. Miami is the test city. If it works here, it goes nationwide, then global. Watch for the signs. Increased compliance, decreased creativity, acceptance of surveillance. The old Miami, the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful Miami, is dying. Replaced by something orderly, controlled, inhuman. You're the guardian now. Keep watching, keep fighting. And remember, in a world where thoughts can be controlled, thinking freely is the ultimate act of rebellion. They thought they were evolving humanity. But they're killing what makes us human. Our chaos, our unpredictability, our beautiful messy free will. Don't let them win. Sarah destroyed the note after memorizing it. She went back to her patrol, watching, documenting, waiting. She noticed the changes Norman had predicted. Miami becoming quieter, more orderly, less alive. The art district producing fewer controversial works. The music scene becoming homogenized. Even the food losing its spice, its character. She found others like her, cops who'd noticed patterns, doctors who'd asked too many questions, teachers who'd seen students change. They formed a new network, more careful than Norman's, more hidden. They couldn't stop the program, but they could preserve evidence, protect some people, Keep the flame of resistance alive. On quiet nights, patrolling the sterile streets of the new Miami, Sarah thought about Norman. Was he dead? Converted? Or locked away somewhere like Arthur? Being studied, experimented on? She'd probably never know. But she kept her promise, she kept watching. 5 years later, Sarah was now Sergeant Chen, working from within the system that had destroyed Norman. She'd learned to hide her knowledge, to appear compliant while secretly documenting everything. The program had spread to 50 cities. The technology was so advanced now that people could be influenced without any physical contact at all. She received an encrypted file one day, source unknown. It was surveillance footage from a facility in Nevada. Rows of beds, each occupied by someone connected to machines. The camera panned across the faces, and Sarah's heart stopped. Norman was there. Alive, but unconscious, electrodes attached to his skull. The timestamp showed the footage was recent. He'd been there for years, his brain being mapped, studied, used to perfect the technology he'd fought against. The message with the file said simply, "The Guardians never die. They become the blueprint." Sarah understood. Norman, Arthur, and all the others who'd resisted weren't just eliminated. They were studied. Their minds picked apart to understand how they'd seen through the programming, how they'd resisted the influence. That knowledge was being used to create more sophisticated control methods, ones that even the most vigilant couldn't detect. But the fact that someone had sent her this footage meant there were still people fighting from within. The resistance lived on, hidden, careful, but alive. Sarah looked out at the Miami skyline, its lights twinkling in perfectly ordered patterns. Somewhere in those towers, in those clinics, in those government buildings, the program continued. People were being rewritten, their free will stolen, their humanity edited out. But also, somewhere in those same buildings there were people like whoever had sent her that footage. People who remembered what humanity was supposed to be. People who refused to let the light die. She thought of Norman's final words. In a world where thoughts can be controlled, thinking freely is the ultimate act of rebellion. Sarah made a choice. She would continue Norman's work, but differently. Instead of fighting openly, she would work from within, rising through the ranks, gaining access to higher levels of the program. It might take years, decades even, but eventually she would be in a position to expose everything. The story wasn't over. It had evolved, just like the program itself. The battle for human consciousness continued, fought in shadows and silence, guardian against programmer, free will against control. And somewhere, in a facility in Nevada, Norman's unconscious mind still fought, still resisted, even in dreams. His brain patterns disrupting their experiments, his consciousness refusing to be fully mapped or controlled. Even unconscious, he was still a guardian, still protecting humanity in the only way left to him. The October wind blew through Miami's streets, carrying the salt smell of the bay, one of the few things that hadn't changed. Sarah breathed it in, remembering the Miami that was, fighting for the Miami that could be again. The watch continued, the guard remained, and somewhere in the controlled, programmed silence, the spark of human rebellion refused to die.